Behind the glittering crowns and majestic palaces lies a world of secrets that could change the course of history, a world of hidden illnesses, confidential diagnoses, and medical emergencies kept far from the public eye. For centuries, royal courts have been masters of illusion, carefully crafting an image of divine health and unwavering strength, while behind closed doors, the most powerful figures on the globe grappled with ailments deemed too shocking, too controversial, or too politically damaging to ever be revealed. This is the clandestine world where a single diagnosis could topple an empire, where a monarch's fever could spark international panic, and where the private struggles of kings and queens were locked away in vaults, their truth known only to a trusted few. It's a realm of whispered conspiracies, hushed-up operations, and desperate cover-ups that have shaped dynasties and altered the fate of nations, all concealed beneath a veneer of royal perfection. Imagine the immense pressure to maintain an image of infallibility while your own body is betraying you, all while the world watches, completely unaware. The stakes in this hidden world of royal health crises were impossibly high, where a simple cough could be seen as a sign of weakness and a serious condition could be interpreted as a loss of divine favor, threatening not just a throne, but the very stability of a nation. It's a powerful reminder that for all their wealth and power, royalty could not escape the universal human experiences of sickness and mortality. Yet they were forced to navigate these challenges under a microscope of political intrigue and public expectation, unlike anything we can comprehend today. This journey takes us deep into the shadows of the world's most exclusive and secretive institutions, where the health of a single individual was never just a private matter, but a state secret of the highest order, guarded with a ferocity that often surpassed the protection of national treasures or military strategies. It's a story not just of medicine, but of power, perception, and the profound lengths to which institutions will go to control the narrative surrounding their leaders, revealing a side of royalty that is far more human, fragile, and fraught with peril than the official portraits would ever suggest. From mysterious wasting diseases labeled as mere fatigue to catastrophic mental health crises explained away as eccentricities, we are about to pull back the velvet curtain on the most confidential and controversial royal illnesses ever recorded. These are the stories that were meant to stay buried, the medical truths considered too dangerous for public consumption, and the personal battles fought in absolute secrecy that, once uncovered, offer a stunningly different perspective on some of history's most pivotal moments. You are about to discover how a queen's hidden condition influenced a critical treaty, how a king's undisclosed ailment led to a disastrous war, and how the relentless pressure to appear invincible drove some rulers to extremes of deception that would shock even the most seasoned historian. This exploration is not merely a catalog of illnesses, but a voyage into the heart of royal power, where the body of the monarch was, in many ways, the body politic itself, and where the line between personal health and national security was perpetually blurred. So prepare to step inside the royal sick room, to hear the whispers of court physicians sworn to secrecy, and to understand the immense human cost of a life lived under the weight of a crown, where even the most basic truths about one's own health could become the most heavily guarded secrets of the state. Consider the plight of King George III, a monarch whose very public descent into what was then labeled madness became a source of national scandal and a constitutional crisis. For over 2 centuries, the popular image has been of a raving lunatic, a king so deranged he had to be strapped to a chair while physicians bled and blistered him in futile attempts to cure his mind. But the truth buried beneath this brutal caricade is far more complex and physically agonizing. The king's suffering was not merely a mental affliction. It was a profound and systemic physical illness, one his doctors did not understand and his government could not afford to publicly acknowledge. The real story is one of a hidden torment, a series of violent and debilitating attacks that were meticulously documented, yet deliberately obscured, all to preserve the illusion of a stable, divinely appointed ruler at the helm of a burgeoning empire. During these episodes, his physicians recorded symptoms that went far beyond erratic speech or confusion. They wrote of his urine turning a deep port wine color, a classic sign of a rare metabolic disorder now known as porphyria. They noted crippling abdominal pain so severe the king would scream for hours, muscle weakness that left him unable to walk, and skin so sensitive he could not bear the touch of his own bed sheets. These are not the hallmarks of insanity, but of a body in acute biochemical distress. The porphyria hypothesis, first seriously proposed in the 1960s, suggests that George III was a victim of a genetic flaw that causes a dangerous buildup of porphyrins, natural chemicals essential for making heme in our blood. When these levels spike, they can attack the nervous system, causing everything from hallucinations and paranoia to extreme pain and seizures. This modern diagnosis reframes his entire reign. His notorious ramblings, famously arguing with an oak tree he believed was the King of Prussia, were likely the result of a brain inflamed by toxic levels of these compounds, not a simple fracture of his sanity. The political consequences of concealing this illness were immense. Each time the king fell ill, the machinery of government would shudder to a halt. With no clear mechanism for a regency during his first major attack in 1788, the nation teetered on the brink of paralysis. The Prince of Wales and the political opposition circled, eager to seize power, while Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger fought desperately to maintain stability, knowing that full disclosure of the king's condition could trigger a catastrophic power struggle. The king's physicians became unwitting agents of the state, their primary duty shifting from healing their patient to managing the perception of his health. Their bulletins were masterpieces of evasion, referring to a bilious fever or a temporary indisposition. Anything to avoid the terrifying word madness and the constitutional chaos it would unleash. The treatments they administered, far from being mere brutality, were the standard practices of the era, yet they undoubtedly exacerbated his suffering. Repeated purges, blisterings, and bleedings would have further stressed a body already struggling to cope with a metabolic crisis, creating a vicious cycle of illness and intervention. This cover-up, however well-intentioned from a state perspective, came at an enormous human cost. Isolated from his family, subjected to restraining devices, and tormented by physicians he grew to distrust, George III experienced a profound personal tragedy. He was a pious man, a devoted husband and father, who was acutely aware of his own lapses and the burden his illness placed upon the nation. During his lucid periods, the humiliation and fear must have been overwhelming. His story is a stark illustration of the ultimate royal paradox. The most powerful man in Britain was utterly powerless over the narrative of his own body. His agony was not his own. It was a state secret, a political football, and a medical mystery, all while he endured waves of pain that his own century could neither name nor cure. The Porphyria theory, while compelling, is more than just a historical footnote. It's a diagnosis built on a foundation of startling physical evidence, meticulously recorded by the king's own physicians. They described his urine as being the color of dark port wine, a detail that seems almost too specific to be a mere coincidence. This wasn't a simple case of dehydration. It was a classic, telltale sign of acute intermittent porphyria, a condition where the body fails to properly produce heme, a crucial component of hemoglobin. This breakdown leads to a buildup of toxic porphyrin precursors in the bloodstream, which are then excreted, turning the urine a deep reddish purple. When left standing, this urine can even darken further due to a chemical reaction, a phenomenon that was almost certainly witnessed in the royal sick room, but utterly misunderstood at the time. This single symptom, so carefully noted yet completely misinterpreted, unlocks the entire mystery. The king's agonizing abdominal pain, which his doctors attributed to bile, was likely the result of these toxins attacking his nervous system, causing what we now recognize as severe neuropathic pain. His episodes of weakness, paralysis, and even the skin sensitivity that made his linens feel like sandpaper are all textbook manifestations of a porphyric attack. A modern analysis of his medical records reveals a clear pattern. These debilitating episodes were often preceded by periods of immense stress, such as political crises or personal grief, which are known triggers for porphyria attacks. The triggers, the symptoms, and the cyclical nature of his illness all align with a genetic, metabolic disorder far more than they do with any primary psychiatric condition. This biochemical perspective forces a complete re-evaluation of his so-called madness. His infamous ramblings, his hours of incessant talking, and his periods of confusion and paranoia are now seen not as signs of lunacy, but as symptoms of encephalopathy, a brain inflamed and poisoned from within. He wasn't losing his mind in a philosophical sense. His brain was literally under a biochemical assault that distorted his perception of reality. This modern understanding transforms King George from a pitiable madman into a tragic figure, enduring a relentless, physically painful disease with a bravery that was completely invisible to his contemporaries and to history for over 200 years. Of course, the monarchy and the government of the day had no concept of porphyria. Their focus was singular: to manage the perception of the king's health at all costs. The public bulletins issued by his physicians were masterclasses in political spin, designed to conceal the terrifying truth. They used vague, almost gentle terms like a disorder of the bile and a feverish complaint, euphemisms that painted a picture of a temporary physical ailment rather than a profound and recurring crisis of the mind and body. The very word mad was avoided with a determined vigilance, as its utterance could have shattered the divine right of kings and plunged the nation into a constitutional abyss. Every twitch, every cry of pain, Every moment of delirium behind the palace walls was a state secret, guarded with the same intensity as a military campaign. The king's own body became a battlefield, and the war was for public confidence. This manipulation of perception was a desperate, and in many ways, a successful strategy. By controlling the narrative, the crown and parliament maintained a fragile stability, navigating the regency crises that erupted with each new attack. Yet this success came at a devastating personal price for the monarch, who was isolated, misunderstood, and subjected to medical treatments that, while standard for the era, only served to exacerbate his suffering. The bleeding and purging would have further weakened a body already in acute metabolic distress, likely making his attacks more severe and prolonged. The story of King George III's Porphyria is therefore a dual tragedy, a story of a man betrayed by his own biology, and a story of an institution so focused on its own survival that it was forced to obscure the human suffering at its very heart. It reveals the profound lengths to which a monarchy will go to project an image of invulnerability, even when the person at its center is grappling with an invisible torment that science was centuries away from being able to name, let alone cure. While the British monarchy scrambled to conceal the king's porphyria, an even more devastating genetic secret was silently making its way across the continent, carried in the bloodline of another powerful queen, and destined to ignite a revolution that would change the world forever. This story begins not in the opulent halls of the Winter Palace, but in the constrained court of 19th century Britain, with a woman known as the grandmother of Europe, Queen Victoria. Unbeknownst to her, she was a carrier of a genetic mutation for hemophilia, a condition that impairs the blood's ability to clot. This royal secret, passed silently from mother to son, or through daughters who became carriers themselves, would become a ticking time bomb in the heart of the Russian Empire. Victoria's youngest son, Leopold, was a hemophiliac who died from a minor fall at the age of 30. But it was through the marriage of her granddaughter, Alex of Hesse, to Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, that this genetic flaw was delivered directly onto the world stage with catastrophic consequences. The arrival of their long-awaited heir, Tsarevich Alexei, in 1904, was a moment of national jubilation that quickly turned into a private nightmare. Within weeks, it became horrifyingly clear that the boy was a severe hemophiliac. A simple bump could lead to days of internal bleeding into his joints and muscles, causing excruciating pain and life-threatening swellings. For his parents, the diagnosis was a death sentence disguised as a birthright. Every childhood stumble, every minor cut, was a potential crisis. They watched in helpless terror as their son, the future autocrat of all the Russias, would scream in agony from bleeds that made his limbs swell to twice their size, his body a prison of unbearable pain. The political implications were staggering. In an empire that revered the Tsar as a divinely appointed father to his people, the heir's profound physical weakness was a state secret of the highest order. The very concept of a frail, bleeding boy as the future symbol of imperial strength was unthinkable. A public revelation would have been seen as a sign from God that the Romanov line had lost its divine sanction. Consequently, Alexei's condition was concealed from the Russian people with an obsessive secrecy. Only the innermost circle of the family and a few trusted servants knew the truth. The public saw a beautiful, spirited boy in carefully staged photographs. They never saw him carried on a sailor's back because he couldn't walk, or witnessed the paralyzing fear that gripped the palace each time he developed a new bruise. This desperate secrecy created a vacuum of hope, a void that would soon be filled by a figure who seemed to step out of the pages of a dark folktale. Into this world of medical helplessness and imperial desperation stepped Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian mystic whose alleged ability to stop the Tsarevich's bleeding episodes made him indispensable to the royal family. When court physicians stood by, powerless to ease their son's suffering during a severe bleed, the empress, in an act of sheer maternal despair, turned to this unkempt, charismatic peasant. The results from the family's perspective were nothing short of miraculous. Rasputin would often pray by the boy's bedside, and on multiple occasions, Alexei's condition would strikingly improve. Modern historians and medical professionals speculate that Rasputin's methods, while wrapped in mysticism, may have had a basis in rudimentary hypnotic suggestion or a powerful, calming presence. He would likely sternly order the physicians away, halt their painful treatments like aspirin, which actually worsens bleeding, and create a tranquil environment. His deep, soothing voice and unwavering confidence could have lowered the boy's stress and blood pressure, which in turn may have slowed the hemorrhage. To Alexandra, a deeply religious woman watching her son teeter on the brink of death, this was not trickery. It was divine intervention. Rasputin was the man sent by God to save her son, and by extension, the dynasty itself. This absolute faith transformed Rasputin from an occasional healer into the most powerful unofficial advisor in Russia. The empress, fiercely protective of her son and increasingly isolated from the political realities of her crumbling empire, came to rely on Rasputin's counsel on matters of state, believing he was guided by divine will. Nicholas, often away at military headquarters during the First World War, left Alexandra in charge, and she, in turn, was heavily influenced by the mystic. Rasputin's notorious interference in church and government appointments, his scandalous behavior in the capital, and the widespread perception that a peasant was controlling the throne through the Tsarina, fatally damaged the monarchy's prestige. The secret of Alexei's hemophilia and the resulting reliance on Rasputin created a perfect storm of public distrust and political instability. The rumor mills of Petrograd churned with wild tales of a German Tsarina and a depraved monk betraying Russia to the enemy. The Romanovs, who had hidden their son's illness to project an image of strength, were now seen as hopelessly weak, corrupt, and under the thumb of a sinister influence. The private medical tragedy unfolding in the palace became inextricably linked with the public tragedy of a nation at war. The hemophilia that flowed through Alexei's veins did not cause the Russian Revolution, but it critically weakened the pillar holding up the entire autocratic structure, the perceived infallibility and strength of the Tsar. It drove the royal family inward, making them prioritize their private crisis over the monumental public one, and it delivered to their enemies the most potent symbol of their decay, the mysterious, manipulative Rasputin. When the revolution finally came, the Romanovs were not just overthrown by political radicals. They were toppled by a narrative they had helped create, a narrative of a family so consumed by a private secret that they had become alien to the people they were destined to rule. The Bolshevik bullets in a Yekaterinburg basement were the final, brutal chapter of a story that began with a single, faulty gene passed down from a queen. A story that demonstrates, with heartbreaking clarity, how a confidential health crisis in one royal nursery could ultimately help bring down a 300-year-old dynasty and alter the course of the 20th century. Yet it was this very desperation, born from the terror of watching her son suffer, that forged an unbreakable bond between the Tsarina and the mystic, a relationship that would become the single greatest liability for the Romanov throne. Alexandra's world had shrunk to the four walls of the nursery, where the faintest cry from Alexei could plunge the entire imperial household into a state of high alert. The protocols for secrecy were Byzantine in their complexity. When a bleeding episode occurred, official engagements were canceled under vague pretenses: a sudden cold, a minor digestive complaint. The court photographers were instructed to capture the boy only in carefully curated moments of apparent health, often seated or supported by his sturdy sisters. His sailor nanny, a dedicated man named Derivenko, was never far, his primary duty being to carry the air so he would not fatigue himself or, worse, fall. Inside the palace, the truth was a heavy, shared burden. Servants were sworn to silence on pain of dismissal or worse, and the few physicians allowed to attend the Tsarevich knew their careers, and perhaps their lives, depended on their discretion. This culture of absolute secrecy meant that the Russian people, who revered their little father, the Tsar, with near religious fervor, were completely in the dark. They saw a dynasty that appeared divinely strong, its lineage secure with a handsome male heir. They had no idea that the future autocrat of 1/6 of the world's landmass was a boy whose body was a fragile vessel, whose life could be extinguished by a single misstep. This deception, while intended to preserve stability, created a dangerous chasm between the perception of the monarchy and its fragile reality. Into this void of sanctioned lies and private agony stepped Grigory Rasputin, a figure who seemed to defy all natural laws. His treatments for Alexei's bleeding episodes were a blend of peasant intuition, hypnotic charisma, and what appeared to be genuine, inexplicable success. When a frantic summons would arrive, Rasputin would often appear at the palace, his presence alone sometimes enough to calm the hysterical empress. He would stride into the sick room, occasionally sending the helpless doctors away, and adopt a method that was starkly different from their painful, ineffective interventions. He would pray loudly at the boy's bedside, his voice a low, resonant drone. He would sometimes simply sit and speak to Alexei in a soothing, commanding tone, telling him he was strong, that the pain would recede, that he was loved and protected. The crucial and often overlooked element of his approach was what he stopped from happening. He reportedly forbade the administration of aspirin, a common painkiller at the time which, unbeknownst to all, is a blood thinner that dramatically worsens hemophilic bleeding. By halting this harmful treatment, he may have inadvertently allowed the boy's body to begin its own slow, natural clotting process. Furthermore, his calming influence on both Alexei and his frantic mother would have lowered the child's heart rate and blood pressure, reducing the force of the hemorrhage and allowing a clot to form. From a modern medical perspective, Rasputin was likely practicing a crude form of psychosomatic therapy and crisis management, achieving, through suggestion and tranquility, what the physicians could not achieve with their leeches and powders. For Alexandra, a woman whose faith was the bedrock of her existence, there was no room for such secular explanations. To her, this was a miracle. Here was a man of God, a starets or holy elder, who could reach through her son's agony when all of Europe's finest medical minds had failed. Her gratitude was absolute, and from a political standpoint, catastrophic. Rasputin's influence swiftly expanded from the nursery to the throne room. Alexandra, convinced he was divinely guided, began consulting him on matters of state, believing his advice came from a higher power. She would bombard her husband, Tsar Nicholas, with letters at military headquarters, insisting that Russia's fortunes depended on following our friend's counsel. "He only wants to save us," she wrote. "Trust in God and in him." Nicholas, a loving but weak-willed husband, often capitulated, appointing and dismissing ministers based on Rasputin's cryptic pronouncements. The political fallout was immediate and devastating. The aristocratic elite and the politically savvy public in Petrograd were aghast. Rumors spiraled out of control, painting a picture of a debauched mystic controlling the empress, who was German-born and through her, the Tsar himself. In the brutal context of the First World War, this narrative was lethal. It gave rise to whispers of treason, of a pro-German faction at the highest level of court seeking a separate peace with the enemy. The confidential health crisis of a single boy had, through a chain of desperation and secrecy, metastasized into a full-blown political cancer. The Romanovs, by hiding Alexei's hemophilia to project an image of divine strength, had instead created the perfect conditions for their own demonization. They appeared not as strong rulers, but as gullible fools, their judgment clouded by superstition and their loyalties suspect. The private tragedy of a bleeding child became the public scandal that broke the back of the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty, proving that no secret, no matter how closely guarded within palace walls, can remain hidden forever when it holds the power to shape the destiny of nations. The genetic shadow cast by Queen Victoria did not stop at the Russian border. As her daughters and granddaughters married into the great royal houses of Europe, they carried with them the hidden, lethal gift of hemophilia, transforming the family disease into a continental crisis. This was a tragedy of dynastic politics, where the very practice of intermarriage meant to cement alliances and ensure peace, instead became the mechanism for spreading a debilitating and fatal illness. Victoria's daughter, Princess Alice, passed the gene to her daughter, Alex, who became the doomed Tsarina of Russia. But two other of Alice's daughters, Irene and Alex's older sister, would carry the mutation in different directions to Germany and Spain, where the same desperate playbook of secrecy and denial would be enacted with similarly devastating consequences. Princess Irene married her first cousin, Prince Henry of Prussia, brother of Kaiser Wilhelm II, firmly planting the hemophilia gene within the heart of the ascendant German Empire. Their son, Prince Waldemar, was a hemophiliac. The German court, steeped in a culture of militarism and physical prowess, found the condition deeply shameful, a stark contradiction to the image of Teutonic strength the Kaiser sought to project. Waldemar's condition was a closely guarded secret, his childhood a series of managed risks and hidden crises. The family lived in a state of constant, low-grade anxiety. knowing that a simple boyhood scrape could lead to a medical emergency. Yet, the German branch of the family would experience a peculiar and heartbreaking twist of fate. Waldemar managed to survive into adulthood, marrying and even living through the chaos of the Second World War. His story highlights a cruel irony of the disease before modern medicine. Survival was often a matter of sheer luck and the severity of the specific genetic mutation. Tragically, his older brother, Prince Henry, had also been a hemophiliac and died at the age of 4 after a minor fall, a stark reminder of the disease's random brutality. The Prussian insistence on stoicism and the concealment of weakness meant that these personal catastrophes were absorbed silently within the palace walls, their public impact minimized, but the private toll on the family was immeasurable. It was in Spain, however, where the political consequences of this royal secret reached their most poignant and public crescendo. Queen Victoria's youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, was also a carrier. Her daughter, Victoria Eugenie, known as Ina, married King Alfonso XIII of Spain in a lavish ceremony that was nearly shattered by an assassination attempt. A bombing that sprayed blood across her wedding gown, a grim omen of the blood that would define her life. Ina, like her cousin Alexandra in Russia, unknowingly carried the hemophilia gene into her marriage. The birth of their first son and heir, Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, was a moment of national celebration that soon curdled into private horror. The infant prince bled persistently from his navel, and the terrifying diagnosis was confirmed. King Alfonso was reportedly devastated, and in a cruel reflection of the attitudes of the time, grew distant from his wife, blaming her for introducing the corrupted blood into the Spanish Bourbon line. The Spanish court immediately plunged into a regime of secrecy, even more intense than that in Russia. The public was told the prince was simply delicate. His younger brother, Infant Gonzalo, was also a hemophiliac, compounding the dynasty's crisis. The lives of these boys were a series of sheltered, constrained routines. They were accompanied everywhere by vigilant aides who carried special medical kits. They were forbidden from riding bicycles or participating in the rough and tumble activities of other royal children. Every public appearance was a calculated risk, a performance of normalcy designed to quell the rumors that inevitably swirled through Madrid. The strain of this perpetual concealment, of managing two fragile heirs in the volatile political atmosphere of pre-Civil War Spain, placed an unbearable burden on the monarchy. The king's alienation from the queen, the constant fear for his sons' lives, and the gnawing anxiety over the succession created an atmosphere of perpetual crisis within the royal household. The private tragedy culminated in a series of devastating and very public accidents. Prince Alfonso, the heir to the throne, was involved in a minor car crash that caused severe internal bleeding and necessitated the surgical removal of a kidney. A few years later, his brother Gonzalo died after another minor automobile incident in Austria, where a slow internal bleed went untreated until it was too late. These were not quiet deaths in a palace sick room. They were modern, violent ends that made a mockery of the court's carefully constructed facade. The Spanish people, already grappling with political unrest and anti-monarchist sentiment, saw a royal family that appeared not only out of touch, but also cursed. The inability to produce a healthy, robust male heir was interpreted by many as a sign that the Bourbon dynasty was exhausted, its divine favor withdrawn. The confidential health crisis of the princes became a powerful symbol of the monarchy's inherent weakness and its failure to modernize and connect with the nation it ruled. While hemophilia did not single-handedly cause the fall of the Spanish monarchy, the rise of republicanism and the social upheaval of the 1930s were the primary forces. It critically sapped the institution's morale and legitimacy from within. King Alfonso XIII was eventually forced into exile in 1931. His reign ended by a republic. The silent suffering of his sons, a secret meant to protect the throne, ultimately became one of the most visible cracks in its foundation, demonstrating once again that in the gilded world of royalty, a private genetic flaw could carry more political destructive power than any army or political opponent. But while the genetic scourge of hemophilia ravaged continental dynasties, a different kind of health crisis was unfolding in post-war Britain, one where the enemy was not a hereditary flaw, but a personal habit, and the looming specter of cancer. The reign of King George VI, the reluctant monarch who had steadied the nation through the Blitz and the war, was defined by a public image of quiet, unshakable duty. Yet behind this facade, a desperate and clandestine battle was being waged against a disease so stigmatized and feared that its very existence had to be denied. The king was a heavy smoker, a habit shared by millions of his subjects, but for him, it led to a confidential diagnosis of lung cancer that would test the palace's machinery of secrecy to its absolute limit. The first signs of serious trouble emerged in the spring of 1951. The king, always a man of slight build, began to appear gaunt and pale. A persistent hacking cough that was initially dismissed as a winter chill failed to subside. Behind the scenes, his physicians grew increasingly concerned. In secret, they performed a bronchoscopy, a procedure where a tube is inserted into the airways, and the results were dire. A malignant tumor was discovered in the king's left lung. For the monarchy, still re-establishing its footing in a new, austere Britain, the news was catastrophic. The concept of a king, the symbolic head of state, battling a disease so strongly associated with mortality and personal vice, was unthinkable. It threatened to shatter the carefully cultivated image of resilience he had built during the war. A decision was made at the highest levels. The truth would be concealed. The public was told the king was suffering from catarrhal inflammation and needed a period of rest. This was the official story, a masterclass in benign misdirection designed to avoid panic and preserve the dignity of the crown. The reality was far more drastic. On the 23rd of September, 1951, the king was admitted to Buckingham Palace for a secret and immensely dangerous operation. In a specially constructed operating theater within the palace itself, a team of surgeons led by Sir Clement Price Thomas performed a left pneumonectomy, the complete removal of the king's left lung. The surgery itself was a monumental undertaking, pushing the boundaries of thoracic medicine at the time. For hours, the fate of the monarchy literally rested on the skill of the surgical team working in the heart of the royal residence, a procedure of such magnitude that it could not be risked in a public hospital. The palace's control of information during this period was absolute. The official bulletin released after the surgery was a masterpiece of understatement, referring only to structural changes in the lung that had required surgical intervention. The word cancer was meticulously avoided. Instead, the narrative presented to the British people was one of a successful procedure to address a non-specific obstruction, and the king was said to be recovering well, requiring a prolonged convalescence. This was the rest period the public understood, a quiet time for their hard-working monarch to regain his strength. They had no idea he was actually fighting for his life, grappling with the immense physical trauma of having an entire organ removed. The king's own demeanor played a crucial role in this grand deception. Even in his weakened state, he understood his duty to appear strong. When he was well enough to be photographed, the images were carefully staged. He would be pictured sitting in a chair, often with a blanket discreetly covering his thin frame, smiling weakly but determinedly. These images were meant to reassure, to project an image of steady recovery. The press, largely compliant and respectful of the palace's wishes, played along, never probing too deeply into the specifics of his condition. This control of the narrative was deemed essential for national morale. Britain in the early 1950s was a nation still rationing food, still rebuilding its bombed-out cities. The king was a symbol of stability and the enduring spirit that had won the war. To reveal that he was gravely ill with cancer would have been seen as a profound national blow, a sign of vulnerability at a time when the country could least afford it. The palace's strategy was, in the short term, a success. The king recovered sufficiently from the surgery to resume some of his duties, even delivering his Christmas broadcast that year, his voice thin but steady. He was able to see his daughter, Princess Elizabeth, and her husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, off on a tour of the Commonwealth, a tour from which she would return as queen. But the cancer had not been defeated. It had merely retreated. The immense physical strain of the surgery and the underlying progression of the disease had taken an irreversible toll. King George VI died in his sleep on the 6th of February, 1952, from a coronary thrombosis, a direct consequence of his crippled circulatory system struggling to cope after the pneumonectomy. The public, who had been told their king was simply recuperating, was shocked by his sudden passing. The confidential battle with lung cancer, so successfully hidden in life, became the open secret of his legacy. This cover-up stands as a quintessential example of the mid-century royal approach to health crises. The institution mattered more than the individual, and the projection of strength was a duty that extended even into the private sickroom. The king's personal struggle was subsumed by the needs of the crown, his pain and fear hidden behind a veil of official bulletins and staged photographs, a final, silent service from a monarch whose entire life had been defined by duty. The king's reliance on tobacco was not a mere personal indulgence. It was a deeply ingrained habit, forged in the crucible of duty and stress. He had taken up smoking as a young man, part of a generation for whom cigarettes were synonymous with sophistication and a brief respite from pressure. For King George VI, a man naturally shy and afflicted with a debilitating stammer, the simple act of lighting a cigarette may have provided a moment of calm, a psychological crutch to steady his nerves before the countless public speeches and nerve-wracking state functions that defined his role. This dependency only deepened during the war years, when the immense weight of leading a nation through the Blitz and the existential threat of invasion rested squarely on his shoulders. He was often photographed with a cigarette in hand, the smoke curling around his face in images that projected a sense of thoughtful, resolute calm to the public. But behind the palace walls, his consumption was staggering. He was a chain smoker, moving through dozens of cigarettes each day, filling the private apartments with a constant, hazy atmosphere. The toll on his body was gradual but relentless. A persistent, rattling cough became a familiar sound to his family and close staff, often dismissed as a smoker's cough or attributed to the stress of the times. He suffered from recurring bronchitis and arteriosclerosis, conditions his physicians directly linked to his tobacco use. They warned him repeatedly of the dangers, advising him to cut back or quit altogether. Yet, breaking the habit proved impossible for the king. The addiction was powerful, and the psychological need for that small, familiar comfort in a life of immense, unrelenting responsibility was perhaps even stronger. He was a man trapped by his own coping mechanism, watching the warning signs accumulate even as he felt powerless to change. The palace system, designed to support the monarch in every way, inadvertently enabled this self-destructive pattern. Cigarettes were always within easy reach, and his valise ensured his silver cases were perpetually stocked. The culture of the era did not help. In the 1940s and early 50s, the definitive link between smoking and lung cancer was only beginning to emerge in medical circles, and it was not yet the widely accepted public health fact it is today. To many, including the king's own doctors, the habit was still seen as a personal vice rather than a direct death sentence. Their warnings, while sincere, likely lacked the dire urgency they would carry just a decade later. This created a perfect storm, a king using nicotine to manage the immense stress of his office, a medical establishment not yet fully armed with the conclusive evidence to force a change, and a court culture that catered to his every whim, including the one that was slowly killing him. By the time the first truly alarming symptoms appeared, the dramatic weight loss, the deepening pallor, the cough that would not abate, the damage was already done. The tumor in his lung was a silent, growing consequence of thousands upon thousands of cigarettes, a private addiction that would soon demand a very public and desperate response from the institution dedicated to protecting him. As his health faltered, the palace machinery shifted into its most secretive mode, moving beyond merely managing his schedule to actively constructing a fiction of robust health for public consumption. The king's inner circle, including his private secretary and senior courtiers, understood that the monarchy's stability was perceived as intertwined with the physical robustness of the sovereign. The news that the king, the same figure who had stood resilient in London during the bombing, was now succumbing to a debilitating and potentially fatal disease, was unthinkable. It was a narrative they were determined to prevent at all costs. The cover-up was not born of malice, but of a profound institutional belief that the truth would weaken the nation. Their methods were meticulous. Official bulletins became exercises in vague, reassuring language. The term catarrhal inflammation was deliberately chosen. It sounded medical enough to be credible, yet mild and temporary enough to avoid alarm. It suggested a stubborn chest cold, not a life-threatening malignancy. When the king's left lung was surgically removed within Buckingham Palace, the public was told he had undergone a procedure for an obstruction, a word that carefully sidestepped the terrifying reality of cancer. The press, for the most part, was complicit in this deception. A gentleman's agreement existed between the palace and the major newspapers. The royal family's private lives, and especially their health, were largely off limits. Reporters received the sanitized bulletins and did not dig deeper. Photographs were carefully staged and released by the palace press office to reinforce the narrative of recovery. They showed the king sitting in a chair, often with a rug over his knees, looking wan but smiling bravely. These images were meant to convey convalescence, not the brutal aftermath of a radical pneumonectomy. The king himself was a willing participant in this charade, understanding his duty to project strength, even as he fought through pain and exhaustion. His staff became experts in illusion, timing his public appearances for when he had the most energy, keeping visits short, and ensuring he was never seen struggling for breath. This elaborate performance was deemed a necessary service to the country, a final duty for a king who had always placed his role above his personal comfort. Yet this cover-up had a profound and poignant cost. It meant the king faced his illness in a kind of isolated silence, his true condition a secret even from his own subjects. The public, who had shared his trials during the war, were now shielded from his greatest personal battle. They sent get-well cards for a chest cold. Unaware, they were wishing recovery to a man who had just lost an entire lung to cancer. This disconnect between the carefully managed public image and the harsh, private reality encapsulates the ultimate burden of royalty. Even in his most vulnerable human moment, the king could not truly be seen as merely a man fighting a disease. He was an institution, a symbol, and his body was a vessel of state that had to appear inviolable until the very end. While the world saw a rebellious princess living a life of glamour and privilege, the reality for Queen Elizabeth's younger sister was a private torment of profound loneliness and depression, a struggle that the royal family's unwavering commitment to public stoicism forced her to endure almost entirely in secret. Princess Margaret was, in many ways, a woman born into the wrong era. Her vibrant spirit and thirst for a modern life of passion and purpose, constantly clashing with the ancient, rigid protocols of the monarchy. From a young age, she was trapped in a gilded cage of expectations, forever the spare to her sister's heir, a role that offered immense privilege but very little meaning or agency. Her entire identity was defined in relation to someone else, and as the years passed, this lack of a concrete role within the institution created a deep and abiding sense of emptiness. The first great blow to her emotional well-being, and the one that would cast a long shadow over her entire life, was the brutal termination of her relationship with Group Captain Peter Townsend. This was not merely a forbidden romance. It was the pivotal moment where she learned, in the most painful way possible, that her personal happiness was entirely secondary to the perceived needs of the crown. She was deeply in love with a war hero, a man she had known for years, but he was a divorced man, and in the 1950s, the Church of England and the establishment deemed such a union impossible for the Queen's sister. The choice presented to her was cruel and absolute: renounce her royal duties and her place within the family, or give up the man she loved. Her decision to ultimately sacrifice Townsend for her duty, made under immense pressure from the government and senior courtiers, was an act of self-immolation from which her spirit never truly recovered. It instilled in her a fundamental belief that her own needs were invalid, that her desires were a threat to the institution, and it planted the seed of a resentment that would fester for decades. This heartbreak was followed by a marriage to photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones, later Lord Snowdon, that began as a fairy tale of modern love, but quickly descended into a bitterly competitive and emotionally destructive partnership. Armstrong Jones was brilliant and creative, but he was also mercurial and unfaithful, and their home became a battleground of rivalrous egos and public scandals. The constant humiliations, the tit-for-tat affairs conducted in the glare of an increasingly aggressive press, and the ultimate collapse of the marriage further eroded her self-esteem and reinforced her isolation. She was now not just the tragic princess who lost her love, but a divorcee in a family that still viewed marital breakdown with horror, making her feel even more of an outsider. Within the confines of the royal family, there was little understanding or support for what we would now recognize as clinical depression. The prevailing attitude was the stiff upper lip, a wartime mentality that demanded emotional suppression and outward composure, no matter the internal cost. Mental health struggles were viewed as a failure of character, a lack of moral fiber, not a legitimate medical condition. There was no room for therapy, for open discussions about feelings, or for acknowledging profound sadness. Her pain was therefore internalized, manifesting as what was often dismissed by insiders as difficult behavior: late-night phone calls to friends, capricious demands, and a growing dependency on alcohol and cigarettes to numb the aching void. Her social circle, the so-called Margaret set, provided a glittering distraction of parties and holidays on Mustique, but it was a world built on superficiality, one that often amplified her loneliness rather than curing it. Surrounded by sycophants and socialites, she rarely experienced the genuine, unconditional friendships that could have offered a lifeline. The relentless press attention, which initially celebrated her as the glamorous, jet-setting royal, gradually turned hostile, painting her as a spoiled, extravagant burden on the public purse. Every photograph, every critical newspaper column was a fresh wound, confirming her deepest fears that she was not truly loved or valued for who she was, but merely tolerated as a spectacle. This toxic combination of unprocessed grief, a toxic marriage, public shaming, and institutional neglect created a perfect storm that led her to seek solace in the very things that would ultimately destroy her health. Her addiction to alcohol and cigarettes was not a mere lifestyle choice. It was a form of self-medication for a pain that had no other outlet in her world. The cocktail hour, a sacred ritual in her daily routine, began earlier and earlier, stretching into long, liquid lunches and evenings where the gin and tonic flowed freely. The cigarettes were a constant companion, a physical manifestation of her nervous energy and a tool to suppress her appetite, leading to the dramatic weight loss that became so noticeable in her later years. The royal household, true to form, treated this escalating crisis as a matter of public relations not healthcare. The focus was on managing the public fallout of her scandals, the leaked divorce details, the controversial friendships, not on addressing the root causes of her despair. She was encouraged to maintain a public schedule, to smile and wave, to perform the part of the princess, even as her private world crumbled. This enforced duality, the pressure to present a flawless facade while internally drowning, took a catastrophic toll. In the 1990s, she suffered a series of very public health crises, including severe lung damage from a lifetime of smoking and a series of strokes that left her partially paralyzed and visually impaired. These physical ailments were the direct, tangible consequences of a lifetime of untreated mental anguish. The confidential battles with depression and addiction, forced into the shadows by the royal family's culture of silence, had finally erupted into plain sight with a devastating and irreversible physicality. Princess Margaret's story is perhaps the most poignant example of the human cost of the royal, stiff upper lip. She possessed the charisma, intelligence, and desire for a meaningful life, yet she was systematically denied the tools, the understanding, and the emotional support to build one. Her suffering was not confidential because it was a state secret, but because the institution she was born into had no language for it, no framework to acknowledge it as anything other than personal failure. In the end, her life stands as a tragic counterpoint to the narratives of kings with porphyria and cervix with hemophilia. Hers was a crisis of the soul, a silent scream in a gilded palace that reverberated for decades, ignored until the damage was too profound to ever be healed. The rigid, unforgiving structure of royal life did more than just deny Princess Margaret her great love. It actively prevented her from finding any healthy outlet for the resulting anguish, forcing her into a pattern of secretive and ultimately harmful coping mechanisms. Within the palace walls, emotional distress was not a condition to be treated with compassion and therapy, but a problem to be managed, first with secrecy and then with pharmaceuticals. As her despair deepened in the years following the Townsend affair, her private physician began discreetly prescribing sedatives, a common practice for high-strung members of the aristocracy at the time. These were not the carefully managed antidepressants of today, but potent tranquilizers like barbiturates, designed to chemically smooth over the symptoms of profound unhappiness. For Margaret, they became a necessary crutch, a way to get through the endless rounds of official engagements that felt increasingly meaningless, to quiet the racing thoughts at night, and to numb the persistent ache of a life half-lived. She was, in effect, being medically subdued to ensure she could continue to perform her royal duties without causing a scene. Her inner turmoil silenced by prescription, so the public would only ever see a composed and smiling princess. This chemical containment was a stark illustration of the palace's priority: stability and image over genuine well-being. Yet even this was not enough, and in a rare, almost revolutionary act for a royal at that time, Margaret did seek out help. She began attending secret therapy sessions with a psychiatrist, a fact kept so confidential that even decades later, the full details remain shrouded. This was a radical and risky step. In the mid-20th century, psychiatry still carried a significant stigma, and for a member of the royal family to acknowledge needing such help would have been viewed as a shocking admission of instability. These sessions had to be arranged with the utmost discretion, a clandestine operation fitting for a spy novel rather than the health care of a king's sister. She would be driven to a private address, away from the prying eyes of the press and the judgmental gaze of the court, for a few precious hours where she could finally speak openly about her pain, her frustrations, and her profound sense of isolation. The very fact that this help had to be sought in secret speaks volumes about the environment she inhabited. Seeking mental health support was seen as a weakness, a betrayal of the stoic, keep calm and carry on ethos that had carried Britain through the war, but was now crushing one of its own princesses from within. The palace system, while aware of these sessions, never publicly acknowledged them, and certainly never celebrated her courage in seeking help. Instead, the official narrative remained one of unwavering denial. Courtiers and senior family members consistently downplayed her struggles, attributing her sometimes erratic behavior to a difficult temperament or the stress of public life. The word depression was never uttered. Addiction was an unthinkable scandal. The strategy was to present an image of a happy, unified family, and Margaret's visible unhappiness was a crack in that carefully varnished portrait. When she would retreat from public view, the announcements would cite a chest infection or exhaustion, the same euphemisms used for physical ailments that were deemed more socially acceptable than a broken spirit. This institutional denial had a corrosive effect on Margaret herself. It invalidated her lived experience, telling her that her pain was not real, or worse, that it was her own fault for failing to cope with the privileges she had been given. Imagine the psychological impact of being surrounded by an institution that refuses to acknowledge your profound distress, that medicates you into compliance, and that forces you to seek the help you need in secret. It reinforces the very isolation that feeds depression, creating a vicious cycle where the only escape seems to be deeper into the very substances that provide temporary relief but long-term ruin. The cocktails and the cigarettes were not merely indulgences. They were the self-administered medicine for a pain that her official medicine could only suppress, and that her family refused to name. This dynamic reveals the brutal logic of the monarchy when faced with a member who does not fit the mold. For a king with porphyria or a tsarevich with hemophilia, the crisis was physical, a tangible enemy that, while hidden, could be understood in a medical context. But Margaret's illness was one of the mind and spirit, something the ancient institution had no framework for handling. A physical ailment could be hidden behind closed doors. A mental health crisis inevitably leaks out in behavior, in mood, in the failure to maintain the impeccable facade. The palace's response was not to adapt or to offer unconditional support, but to tighten the protocols, to enforce the silence, and to manage the public perception ever more tightly, treating the princess not as a suffering human being, but as a public relations problem. In the end, the very system designed to protect her ultimately abandoned her, offering sedatives instead of solace, secrecy instead of support, and denial instead of the simple, healing power of acknowledgement. Her story is a devastating testament to the fact that sometimes the most confidential royal health crises are not about rare diseases or genetic flaws, but about the slow, quiet erosion of a human soul by the immense, impersonal weight of tradition and duty. Yet even as the monarchy grappled with these internal struggles of the mind and spirit, a different kind of confidential health battle was being waged, one that tested the limits of maintaining a public persona of unwavering vitality against the unrelenting march of age. For decades, Prince Philip presented an image of almost superhuman robustness, a man of action who could outwalk aides half his age, a sharp-witted consort whose physical presence was as commanding as his famously blunt commentary. This carefully cultivated identity, however, concealed a series of serious cardiac conditions and surgical interventions that were managed with a level of secrecy befitting a military operation. The first major public crack in this formidable facade appeared in 2011, when the then 89-year-old prince was airlifted from Sandringham to a specialist cardiac unit at Papworth Hospital in Cambridge. The official palace statement was a masterpiece of understatement, announcing that he was being treated for a blocked coronary artery. What the public was not told was the full gravity of the situation. He had undergone a minimally invasive procedure known as a coronary angioplasty, where a tiny balloon was used to open a narrowed artery, and a stent was likely placed to keep it propped open. This was not a minor checkup. It was a significant intervention to prevent a potentially fatal heart attack. The procedure itself was successful, but the very fact that it was necessary revealed a vulnerability that ran completely counter to his public image. The palace's communication strategy was precision engineered to downplay the severity. He was described as being in good spirits and was discharged just a few days later, with the narrative quickly shifting to his remarkable resilience. This set the pattern for the decade to follow. A serious medical event would be immediately reframed as a temporary, successfully resolved issue, with the prince himself playing a crucial role in the performance of recovery. He would be photographed just days after leaving the hospital, walking briskly, often at the wheel of a carriage or engaging in some outdoor activity, the very picture of a man who had merely overcome a minor inconvenience. Behind this public relations triumph, however, lay a much more complex and concerning medical reality. The blocked artery in 2011 was a warning sign of progressive coronary artery disease, a condition where the blood vessels supplying the heart muscle become narrowed by a buildup of fatty plaques. For a man in his 90s, this is not uncommon, but the intensity of the royal schedule and the immense pressure to remain a visible, active part of the monarchy's public face placed a unique strain on his cardiovascular system. Every state banquet, every remembrance service, every long day of public engagements was a physiological demand on a heart that was, in truth, requiring ever more sophisticated management. The palace's approach was to control the narrative with an iron grip, releasing information only on a need-to-know basis and always couching it in the most positive possible terms. The word routine was deployed frequently, as was the phrase precautionary measure, both designed to reassure the public and the media that there was no cause for alarm. This strategy was rooted in a deep-seated institutional belief that the stability of the monarchy is intrinsically linked to the perceived health and strength of its key players. A frail, ailing consort could, in the eyes of courtiers, inadvertently cast a shadow of mortality over the entire institution, particularly as the Queen herself was advancing in years. The immense effort put into projecting Philip's robustness was, in essence, an effort to project the robustness of the monarchy itself. This delicate balancing act between medical necessity and public duty became even more pronounced in the following years. In 2017, at the age of 96, Prince Philip was admitted to King Edward VII's Hospital in London, officially for treatment of an infection. The announcement was, as always, deliberately vague. While an infection was indeed the presenting issue, it was widely reported by well-sourced royal correspondents that this hospitalization also involved monitoring and management of a pre-existing heart condition. The strain that a systemic infection places on the entire body, and particularly on a heart already compromised by age and disease, is significant. His medical team would have been deeply concerned about his cardiac function throughout this period, a level of detail that never made it into the public bulletins. He spent several nights in the hospital, and upon his release, the focus was once again on his quick return to form. The unspoken truth was that each of these health scares was taking a cumulative toll, requiring a gradual but steady scaling back of his duties, a process that was itself managed with meticulous care to avoid the appearance of a sudden decline. His final retirement from public life in 2017 was presented as a long-planned decision made on his own terms, a man gracefully stepping back after decades of service. While there was truth to that, it was also a necessary medical concession, a strategic retreat designed to preserve his health and avoid the public spectacle of a sudden, forced withdrawal due to illness. The most definitive evidence of his ongoing cardiac struggles emerged in late 2019, when he spent 4 nights in the same private hospital following what was described as a precautionary procedure for a pre-existing condition. Insider reports confirmed that this was, in fact, a second, more complex cardiac procedure. The nature of such a follow-up intervention in a man of 98 suggests his coronary artery disease was progressive, requiring further stenting or another angioplasty to address new blockages. The fact that this was handled with such discretion, hidden behind the blanket term pre-existing condition, highlights the palace's unwavering commitment to this confidentiality. They were not merely managing his health, they were managing the perception of his health, ensuring that the world continued to see the durable, unflappable Prince Philip right up until the very end. The immense success of this decades-long project of perception makes it easy to underestimate the seriousness of what he endured. He wasn't just a tough old man weathering minor ailments. He was a patient with a significant chronic cardiac condition, navigating a high-stakes, high-stress role while undergoing repeated invasive procedures. His longevity was a testament to excellent medical care and his own formidable constitution, but it was also a carefully curated performance, one that required him to consistently project vigor even when he may have been feeling anything but. This confidential health saga underscores a modern evolution in royal crisis management. Unlike the catastrophic secrecy surrounding the Romanovs or the brutal medical interventions of King George III's era, Prince Philip's story represents a 21st century version of the same dilemma: how to balance the human reality of aging and illness with the symbolic need for an institution to appear timeless and indefatigable. The palace learned to use vague language and controlled photo opportunities as its primary tools, creating a narrative of minor, surmountable challenges rather than a story of progressive decline. In doing so, they protected both the prince's dignity and the monarchy's image, but they also obscured the very real and very human vulnerability of a man who, for all his public bluster, was engaged in a private, determined battle to keep his own heart beating. Prince Philip's legendary toughness was more than just a personality trait. It was a carefully maintained personal philosophy that often put him at odds with his own medical needs. For decades, he viewed any admission of physical vulnerability as a form of surrender, a betrayal of the self-reliant naval officer's ethos that had defined his entire life. This stubborn independence meant that he would frequently delay reporting symptoms or dismiss the concerns of his doctors, preferring to simply soldier on until a situation became unavoidable. Inside the palace, this created a persistent challenge for his staff and his family, who had to balance their respect for his fierce autonomy with the very real need to ensure he received timely medical care. The strategy that evolved to manage this was one of post-facto announcements. The palace became a master of the retroactive health bulletin, informing the public only after a procedure had been successfully completed and the prince was already on the mend. This approach served multiple purposes, all designed to maintain the facade of unshakable fortitude. By the time the news broke, the narrative was already firmly under their control. They could present the event as a minor, resolved issue, thus preempting any prolonged periods of public speculation or concern. There would be no anxious vigil, no daily updates on a prince undergoing treatment. Instead, the public would learn about a blocked coronary artery only after a stent had been placed, and he was declared in good spirits. This method effectively eliminated the crisis from the public timeline, transforming a potential health scare into a simple, closed case of royal resilience. This meticulous control of information was rooted in a deep institutional memory of past scandals. The palace had learned from the chaotic coverage of Princess Margaret's struggles and the frenzied speculation surrounding other royal health matters that the less said in real time, the better. For a figure like Prince Philip, whose entire public identity was built on action and vigor, a public decline would have been seen as symbolically damaging not just to him, but to the monarchy he served. His body, in a sense, was still an instrument of state, and its perceived durability was part of the crown's projection of stability. Announcing a procedure in advance would have invited a media siege of the hospital and days of headlines questioning his mortality, a spectacle the old-school Duke found deeply distasteful and the institution found politically unhelpful. His own cooperation was essential to this strategy. Even when he was clearly unwell, he understood the script and played his part flawlessly. Upon discharge from the hospital, he would make a point of being photographed, looking active and engaged, often taking the reins of a carriage or walking purposefully, his posture deliberately upright. These were not candid shots. They were carefully staged visual reassurances, designed to show a man who had brushed off a minor inconvenience and was already back to business. This performance was a collaborative effort between his own force of will and the palace's sophisticated communications machinery. The language used in official statements was always deliberately chosen for its calming banality. Words like precautionary, planned, and exploratory were deployed to drain any event of its inherent drama. A major cardiac intervention became a procedure for a pre-existing condition. A hospitalization for a serious infection was framed as observation and treatment. This linguistic curation was a form of genteel misdirection, not to lie, but to frame the facts in the most reassuring light possible. It was a system built on the belief that the public did not need, and perhaps should not have, a full, real-time account of the consort's physical vulnerabilities. The success of this approach meant that Prince Philip's final years were perceived by the outside world as a graceful, gradual slowing down, a man voluntarily stepping back after a long life of service. The immense confidential medical effort required to sustain that image, the repeated cardiac procedures, the careful management of his schedule to conserve his energy, the silent battles with pain and fatigue remained almost entirely hidden. His story represents the modern apex of royal health secrecy, not the desperate cover-up of a genetic flaw or a stigmatized disease, but a managed, dignified, and highly effective long-term campaign to separate the private reality of an aging body from the public symbol of enduring strength. While Prince Philip's health was managed with a focus on his robust, active image, his mother-in-law perfected an even more delicate art, transforming the vulnerabilities of extreme old age into a symbol of cheerful, unwavering service. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, cultivated her public persona as the nation's beloved grandmother with such masterful charm that few could have guessed the series of serious medical ordeals she endured in the final decades of her life. Behind the trademark feathered hats and ever-present smile was a woman navigating a gauntlet of surgeries, cancer scares, and chronic pain, all systematically downplayed by the palace to preserve the carefully constructed image of a sprightly, indomitable matriarch. Her legendary longevity was not simply a matter of good genes. It was a monumental achievement of personal willpower and institutional secrecy, a performance of vitality maintained even when her body was sending very different signals. The first major crack in this serene facade appeared in the summer of 1982, when the 81-year-old Queen Mother was admitted to the King Edward VII Hospital for what was officially described as an abdominal examination. The press and public were told it was a routine checkup, but the reality was far more serious. Surgeons performed a colostomy, a procedure to create an opening in the abdomen for the elimination of body waste, typically required after surgery for bowel cancer or a major blockage. For a woman of her generation and position, this was an intensely private and potentially embarrassing procedure. Yet the palace's announcement was a masterpiece of evasion. There was no mention of cancer or a colostomy. Instead, the focus was on her successful recovery and her expected return to duties. This set a firm precedent for how her health would be handled for the next 20 years. Any alarming diagnosis would be reframed as a minor, temporary inconvenience, and the Queen Mother herself would play the starring role in selling that narrative by appearing in public, smiling and waving, just as soon as she was physically able. The true nature of that 1982 surgery, whether it was for a benign obstruction or for cancer, remains one of the palace's most closely guarded medical secrets. But the necessity of a colostomy strongly suggests a significant and potentially life-threatening condition was successfully treated and then hidden from view. This pattern of surgical resilience continued throughout the 1990s, as the focus shifted from internal ailments to the wear and tear on her frame. In 1993, at the age of 92, she underwent a full hip replacement surgery. For a woman of her advanced years, this is a major operation with a significant risk of complications, a procedure often undertaken only when pain and immobility become unbearable. Yet again, the palace presentation was one of breezy normalcy. The news was released after the fact, and the story was not about a nonagenarian's major orthopedic surgery, but about her remarkable fortitude in facing it. She was photographed convalescing at Clarence House, always smiling, and her return to public life was treated as a foregone conclusion. This was not just a medical event, it was a public relations campaign designed to reinforce the idea of her indefatigability. The hip replacement was followed by a second one just 5 years later, in 1998, when she was 97. The sheer fact of undergoing 2 major joint replacements in her 10th decade is a testament to her physical toughness and her determination to remain mobile and active. But it also speaks volumes about the immense pain she must have been quietly enduring. Severe osteoarthritis that necessitates hip replacement is not a minor ache. It is a debilitating condition that makes every step a trial. For years, the public saw a woman who stood for long periods at ceremonies and walked with a seemingly sprightly step, completely unaware of the artificial joints and managed pain that made it all possible. Each successful surgery and recovery became another chapter in the myth of her eternal youthfulness, another piece of evidence that she was somehow immune to the ordinary ravages of time. The palace communication strategy ensured that these medical interventions were always framed as triumphs of her spirit, never as admissions of physical frailty. The private reality, however, was likely one of a strenuous and constant effort to maintain that public face. Behind the scenes, her life was almost certainly structured around a strict regimen of physiotherapy, pain management, and a carefully controlled schedule to conserve her energy for the public appearances that defined her role. The relentless pressure to perform, to be the smiling, steady presence the nation expected, must have been exhausting, yet she never let the mask slip. This commitment to the performance was rooted in a deeply held sense of duty, one forged in the fires of the Second World War when, as Queen Consort, she refused to leave London during the Blitz, famously stating that the princesses could not leave without her. She would not leave without the king, and the king would never leave. That same stubborn courage was now being applied to her own body, treating each surgery not as a setback, but as a necessary repair to get her back on duty. The most poignant and controversial of her late life health scares came in the year 2000, when she was admitted to the hospital for what was initially announced as a checkup following a fall. During that stay, however, she underwent a procedure to remove a small lump from her face. While the palace insisted it was a minor, non-cancerous growth, well-sourced reports from within her medical circle suggested it was, in fact, a basal cell carcinoma, a form of skin cancer. For a woman who had spent a lifetime attending garden parties and outdoor events, often with minimal sun protection by modern standards, this was a plausible diagnosis. The decision to downplay it, to avoid the word cancer at all costs, was entirely consistent with the long-standing royal policy regarding the disease. The stigma was still so potent that even a common, highly treatable form of cancer like this was seen as a blemish on the image of invincibility, to acknowledge that the nation's grandmother was susceptible to something as mundane as skin cancer would have, in the palace's view, diminished the magic of her persona. It would have made her ordinary, and her entire public identity was built on being extraordinarily constant. Her 100th birthday in 2000 was a national celebration, a testament to her incredible lifespan and her enduring popularity. The image presented to the world was of a centenarian who still enjoyed a daily gin and dubonnet, who retained a twinkle in her eye, and who embodied a timeless, genteel spirit. This was the ultimate victory of the confidential health strategy. The public saw the result, the smiling centenarian, but they were spared the difficult journey, the internal surgeries, the painful hip replacements, the cancer scares, and the daily physical toll of simply being 100 years old. The machinery of the monarchy, with the Queen Mother's full and willing participation, had successfully separated the private reality of an aging, ailing body from the public symbol of enduring cheer and stability. Her story is the ultimate expression of a specific royal philosophy. That duty requires the concealment of personal suffering, and that the institution's need for a symbol can sometimes outweigh an individual's right to be seen as fully human in all their fragility. She became the beloved grandmother precisely because she never allowed the nation to see her as anything else. This masterful separation of her public image from her private reality was not an accidental achievement. It was the result of a meticulously planned and executed operation involving a small, fiercely loyal medical team who understood their primary duty was not just to heal their patient, but to protect her myth. The Queen Mother's physicians and surgeons were more than doctors. They were guardians of a national treasure, sworn to a level of confidentiality that would rival any state intelligence service. Their medical oaths were supplemented by an unspoken but deeply understood loyalty to the crown, a commitment to ensure that the public's perception of the smiling, waving centenarian remained utterly untarnished by the mundane and often grim realities of a body succumbing to the relentless pressures of age. This meant that every diagnosis, every procedure, and every prognosis was filtered through a dual lens. First, the clinical need, and second, the narrative requirement. A hospital admission was never just a medical event. It was a communications challenge to be managed with precision and discretion. The language used in bulletins was deliberately crafted to reassure and minimize alarm. Terms like a recurrence of an old complaint or a period of rest were employed to describe situations that, for any other patient, might be labeled as a major surgery or a serious health scare. This linguistic curation was designed to maintain the fairy tale narrative of a woman who is somehow exempt from the ordinary rules of human biology, whose spirit was so vibrant it could simply brush off physical ailments that would floor someone else. The medical team's success in this endeavor was so complete that the public came to see her frequent hospital visits, in her later years almost as charming eccentricities, brief, planned absences from the public stage from which she would always return, seemingly unchanged. They never saw the immense effort that went into those brief appearances, the careful management of pain and fatigue required to get her dressed, coiffed, and smiling for the cameras just long enough to capture the image that would sustain the myth for another few months. Her personal staff, from ladies in waiting to her private secretary, worked in seamless concert with the doctors to control the flow of information. Leaks were unthinkable. The entire household operated as a single, unified front, understanding that a single misplaced detail about a colostomy bag or the after effects of a hip replacement could shatter the carefully constructed illusion of effortless grace. This created an environment where the Queen Mother's private suffering was not just her own cross to bear, but a shared secret among a trusted few, a burden they all carried to preserve the happiness she represented to millions. The psychological weight of maintaining this duality must have been immense for the Queen Mother herself. The pressure to consistently perform joy and vitality, while privately grappling with the pain of replaced joints, the discomfort of surgical recoveries, and the undeniable fear of her own mortality, required a level of acting skill worthy of an Oscar. There is a profound loneliness in such a performance, a sense that one's true, vulnerable self must remain forever hidden lest it disappoint the audience. Her public cheerfulness was not necessarily a deception, but rather a profound expression of her sense of duty. She believed the nation needed her to be a symbol of continuity and optimism, and she was willing to sacrifice the comfort of being seen as fully human in all her fragility to fulfill that role. This is the ultimate cost of the royal fairy tale, the immense personal energy required to sustain the illusion, and the silent, heroic endurance of those who understand that their individual pain is less important than the collective comfort their perfect image provides. Yet even as the Queen Mother deflected attention from her own ailments with a charming smile, another royal scandal was brewing that would fuse confidential health crises with constitutional catastrophe in a way that threatened the very foundations of the monarchy itself. The abdication of King Edward VIII in 1936 is universally remembered as the king who gave up his crown for the woman he loved, the American divorcee Wallis Simpson. But lurking beneath this romantic narrative is a darker, more medically sordid undercurrent, the persistent and widely believed rumor that the king was suffering from an advanced, debilitating case of syphilis, a diagnosis so politically and personally explosive that it may have forced his hand far more than love alone. These whispers did not emerge from a vacuum. They were fueled by Edward's own well-documented history of reckless promiscuity during his youth as the Prince of Wales, a period when he moved through a fast set of aristocratic socialites and married women, earning a reputation as a playboy with a voracious and often careless appetite. In the early 20th century, syphilis was a disease shrouded in immense shame and fear, a lingering, degenerative illness that could lead to paralysis, blindness, insanity, and a painful, drawn-out death. For a future king to have contracted such a disease was not just a personal tragedy. It was a dynastic nightmare. The official palace line has always been one of absolute denial, dismissing the syphilis rumors as malicious gossip spread by his political enemies to justify his removal. They pointed to his cause of death decades later from throat cancer, with no mention of tertiary syphilis, as definitive proof of his innocence. Yet the circumstantial evidence and the timing of his abdication raise questions that have never been fully put to rest. The theory suggests that by the mid-1930s, Edward was already displaying early signs of neurosyphilis, the stage where the bacteria attacks the brain and nervous system. Those close to him reported increasingly erratic behavior, mood swings, poor judgment, and a strange recklessness that went beyond mere romantic obsession. His infamous, politically naive meeting with Adolf Hitler in 1937, after his abdication, was seen by some not as treasonous sympathy, but as a symptom of a mind already being eroded by disease, a loss of the inhibitions and strategic thinking required of a statesman. The constitutional crisis he provoked was therefore not merely about his desire to marry a divorced woman. It was, according to this shadow narrative, about a prime minister and a government realizing that the man at the head of the state empire was medically, and perhaps mentally, unfit to rule. The prospect of a king progressively losing his mind to syphilis, a modern-day King George III, but with a morally scandalous cause, was a risk the establishment was utterly unwilling to take. The abdication, in this light, was not a romantic sacrifice, but a graceful, forced exit, a way to remove a dangerously compromised monarch without ever having to utter the unspeakable truth in public. It was the ultimate act of royal confidentiality, using the convenient and far more palatable story of a grand romance to conceal what was potentially a devastating medical and moral scandal. This cover-up, if it occurred, would have required the collusion of the highest levels of government in the royal medical household. The king's physicians, sworn to confidentiality, would have been under unimaginable pressure to either misdiagnose the condition or to remain silent about their findings. Medical records from this period, if they ever existed in detail, have never seen the light of day, locked away in the royal archives with a permanence that only deepens the mystery. The treatment for syphilis at the time, if it was even attempted, was itself a brutal ordeal involving toxic compounds like mercury and arsenic, therapies that could be as damaging as the disease itself and would have been impossible to administer discreetly to a sitting monarch. The very logistics of hiding such a debilitating and progressive illness would have been a nightmare, requiring a web of lies about extended holidays, unexplained fatigue, and mysterious convalescences. What makes the Edward VIII syphilis theory so perennially fascinating is the way it inverts the classic royal health narrative. Unlike a child suffering from a genetic flaw like hemophilia, or a king afflicted by a misunderstood metabolic disorder like porphyria, Edward's alleged illness was seen as self-inflicted, the direct consequence of a morally dissolute lifestyle. This added a layer of judgment and condemnation that made the cover-up not just a matter of state security, but of profound moral shame. The establishment's horror was not just that the king was sick, but how he had become sick. It struck at the heart of the monarch's role as moral exemplar and head of the Church of England. To openly acknowledge the disease would have been to admit that the pinnacle of the British aristocracy was morally corrupt, a revelation that could have shattered the deference on which the entire class system was built. The abdication, therefore, served a dual purpose. It resolved the immediate constitutional crisis over his marriage, and it permanently exiled the source of a potential medical scandal, pushing Edward and Wallis into a life of bitter irrelevance far from the centers of power. His subsequent decades in France were marked by further erratic behavior, financial mismanagement, and his disastrous flirtation with the Nazis, all of which have been posthumously interpreted by proponents of the syphilis theory as the slow, unfolding tragedy of tertiary syphilis taking its course. The official cause of his death, throat cancer, does not definitively rule out the earlier presence of the disease, as the two are not mutually exclusive. The rumors have proven so resilient because they fit a compelling, if dark, narrative pattern. The playboy prince, whose greatest vice ultimately costs him his crown and his sanity. A Shakespearean downfall played out in the modern age under the glare of the press, with the truth forever concealed behind the palace gates. Whether fact or malicious fiction, the enduring power of the syphilis rumor demonstrates the terrifying potency of a confidential royal health crisis. It shows that in the calculus of royal power, a king's perceived moral and physical purity could be as important as his political judgment, and that when that purity was irrevocably compromised, the entire machinery of the state could be marshaled to construct a new, more palatable truth, casting a controversial king into the wilderness to protect the timeless and supposedly untainted institution he left behind. The whispers surrounding King Edward VIII's health present a far more sinister and medically complex layer to the abdication crisis, suggesting that his decision was not solely a grand romantic gesture, but potentially a forced retreat prompted by a devastating and deeply shameful diagnosis. The most persistent of these theories posits that the king was suffering from an advanced stage of syphilis, a disease that in its tertiary phase attacks the brain and nervous system, leading to a condition known as neurosyphilis. This would not have been a sudden illness, but the culmination of a decades-long infection, one that could have begun during his notoriously promiscuous youth as the Prince of Wales. By the time he ascended the throne in 1936, the theory suggests the spirochete bacteria responsible for the disease could have already been silently eroding his cognitive faculties, impairing his judgment, and inflaming his already reckless temperament. Those who subscribe to this narrative point to his increasingly erratic behavior during his brief reign, his political naivete, his baffling disregard for constitutional protocol, and his intense, almost obsessive fixation on Wallis Simpson, not as mere character flaws, but as potential neurological symptoms. A man in the grip of early neurosyphilis might exhibit poor impulse control, grandiose delusions, and a profound lack of insight, all of which could have made his determination to marry a twice-divorced woman against the advice of his government seem not just stubborn, but pathologically compulsive. The constitutional crisis, therefore, was not merely about morality. It was about a prime minister and a cabinet coming to the terrifying realization that their monarch was medically, and perhaps mentally, unfit to perform the complex duties of state. The prospect of a king progressively descending into paralysis or madness, a modern-day echo of King George III, but with a morally scandalous cause, was a risk the British establishment was utterly unwilling to take. The abdication, in this chilling light, appears less a romantic sacrifice and more a strategically orchestrated removal, a way to sideline a dangerously compromised sovereign without ever having to utter the unspeakable truth in public. It was the ultimate act of royal confidentiality, using the convenient and emotionally potent story of a king's great love to conceal what was potentially a devastating medical and moral scandal that could have shattered the monarchy's prestige. The logistics of such a cover-up would have been immense, requiring the absolute silence of the royal physicians. A confirmed diagnosis of syphilis in the king would have been a state secret of the highest order, guarded with even more ferocity than military plans. The standard treatment at the time was a brutal regimen involving toxic compounds like mercury and arsenic, therapies that produced severe side effects and would have been impossible to administer discreetly to a sitting monarch. The very idea of the king undergoing such a dangerous and lengthy treatment while attempting to govern is almost unthinkable, making a quiet, forced abdication the only plausible solution for a government desperate to avoid a public health catastrophe layered on top of a constitutional one. This theory, while compelling in its narrative coherence, is fiercely contested and relies heavily on circumstantial evidence and historical rumor. The official cause of Edward's death decades later was throat cancer, with no mention of tertiary syphilis, and his supporters argue that his subsequent decades of life, while marked by poor political judgment and bitterness, do not perfectly align with the classic, rapid physical decline of neurosyphilis. However, the sheer persistence of the whispers points to a deeper truth about the nature of royal power. The body of the monarch is never truly a private vessel. In the eyes of the institution, a self-inflicted, sexually transmitted disease represented a far greater threat than a genetic flaw like hemophilia. It carried a stench of moral failure and personal vice that was utterly incompatible with the monarch's role as the moral head of the Church of England and the symbolic father of the nation. To openly acknowledge such an illness would have been to admit that the pinnacle of the British aristocracy was not just fallible, but morally corrupt, a revelation that could have critically wounded the deference on which the entire class system was partially built. The abdication, therefore, served a dual purpose. It resolved the immediate crisis over his marriage, and it permanently exiled the source of a potential medical scandal, pushing Edward and Wallis into a life of isolated irrelevance far from the centers of power. His subsequent documented sympathy for Nazi Germany, seen by many as the height of poor judgment, is reinterpreted through this lens not as treasonous ideology, but as further evidence of a mind whose faculties were compromised, a man easily manipulated and disconnected from reality. Whether fact or malicious fiction, the enduring power of the syphilis rumor demonstrates the terrifying potency of a confidential royal health crisis. It shows that in the ruthless calculus of royal survival, a king's perceived moral and physical purity could be as important as his political acumen, and that when that purity was irrevocably shattered by disease, the entire machinery of the state could be marshaled to construct a new, more palatable truth, casting a controversial king into the wilderness to protect the timeless and supposedly untainted institution of the crown. Yet even as one monarch's reign was ending under a cloud of rumored disease, a new kind of royal was entering the palace, one whose most profound and confidential battles would be fought not in the political arena, but within the private landscape of her own mind and body. The story of Princess Diana's struggle with bulimia nervosa represents a seismic shift in the history of royal health crises. Here was not a genetic flaw or a disease of old age, but a severe mental health condition born directly from the immense pressures of a life suddenly lived under an unforgiving global spotlight, a condition the palace system was utterly unequipped to handle and desperately tried to conceal. From the very beginning of her engagement to the Prince of Wales, Diana was plunged into a world of suffocating protocol and relentless scrutiny for which nothing in her life had prepared her. The fairy tale narrative presented to the public was a brutal inversion of her private reality. While the world saw a blushing 19-year-old bride, Diana was drowning in isolation, her self-esteem systematically dismantled by the constant comparisons to her husband's former lover, the overwhelming schedules, and the cold, critical atmosphere of a court that valued stoic composure above all else. It was in this cauldron of anxiety and profound loneliness that her bulimia took root. The illness began not long after her engagement, a secret coping mechanism for feelings she felt she could not express. In her own words, she described it as a secret disease, a way to numb the pain and exert a sliver of control in a life where she felt she had none. The binging and purging became a destructive, shame-filled ritual, a physical manifestation of her need to purge the overwhelming emotions and the sense of worthlessness that haunted her. This was not a choice, but a symptom of her profound distress, a cry for help from a woman who felt she had no voice. The palace environment, with its rigid adherence to tradition and its deep-seated fear of scandal, became an unwitting accomplice to her suffering. Mental health issues were viewed not as medical conditions, but as signs of weakness or instability, a dangerous liability for the monarchy's image. There was no support system, no understanding courtier to whom she could confess her torment. Her cries for help were met with bewilderment or, worse, dismissal. The very structure designed to support the royal family was instead reinforcing her isolation, treating her visible unhappiness as a problem to be managed rather than a wound to be healed. Her bulimia was a meticulously guarded secret within the household, known to only a handful of staff who heard the telltale sounds from her bathroom or noticed the erratic patterns around food. The immense pressure to maintain a public facade of glowing health and marital bliss meant that every state banquet, every public walkabout, became an act of breathtaking deception. She would force herself to eat in public, smiling for the cameras, only to retreat to her private rooms to succumb to the illness afterward. The physical toll was devastating exhaustion, dental damage, and a dangerous electrolyte imbalance that could have proven fatal. Yet, the institutional priority was always the same: preserve the image. The narrative of the fairy tale princess was far too valuable to be compromised by the messy, human reality of a serious eating disorder. It was this very desperation that finally drove her to seek help in secret, breaking the royal code of silence in a way that was both courageous and revolutionary. Diana began attending therapy sessions with a practitioner named Stephen Twigg, arranging these clandestine meetings with a level of secrecy typically reserved for state intelligence operations. She would be driven to a nondescript address, often using back entrances and elaborate precautions to avoid the paparazzi. These sessions were her lifeline, a place where she could finally speak her truth without fear of judgment or betrayal. For a woman in her position, this was an act of profound defiance. She was not just seeking healing for herself. She was implicitly rejecting the palace's core belief that personal struggles should be endured in private silence for the sake of the institution. Her therapy was a radical assertion that her mental well-being mattered, that her pain was valid, and that it deserved professional care. This clandestine journey toward health was a pivotal turning point, giving her the strength and the language to eventually confront the sources of her pain more directly. The ultimate rupture of this confidentiality, however, did not come from a palace leak, but from Diana herself, in an act that would forever change the public's relationship with the monarchy. In 1995, she participated in the famous BBC Panorama interview, a broadcast watched by millions around the world. Sitting before the camera, her voice quiet but steady, she laid bare her truth. She spoke openly about her bulimia, labeling it clearly and describing it as a symptom of her deep unhappiness. You inflict it upon yourself because your self-esteem is at a low ebb and you don't think you're worthy or valuable, she explained, offering a stunningly candid insight into the illness's psychological roots. She confirmed the existence of her secret therapy sessions and acknowledged her struggles with postpartum depression. In doing so, she single-handedly shattered decades, if not centuries, of royal tradition. She transformed a confidential health crisis into a public conversation, forcing the world to see the human cost of the fairy tale. The interview was a direct challenge to the palace's entire philosophy of secrecy. For an institution built on the careful control of image, her raw honesty was tantamount to treason. Yet for the public, it was a moment of profound connection. Millions of people struggling with similar issues in silence saw a princess, a global icon, giving voice to their own private shame and pain. She demystified mental illness and eating disorders, framing them not as moral failings, but as understandable human responses to overwhelming pressure and emotional distress. Diana's decision to go public fundamentally redefined the concept of royal strength. For generations, strength had been synonymous with the stiff upper lip, with emotional suppression and unwavering composure. Diana redefined it as the courage to be vulnerable, the power in asking for help, and the resilience required to face one's own demons openly. Her legacy in this realm is immeasurable. She created a new vocabulary for discussing mental health within a context of fame and immense pressure, paving the way for a more compassionate public discourse. Her actions forced the royal family itself to gradually, and often reluctantly, begin to modernize its approach to these issues. While the institution would continue to value discretion, the genie was out of the bottle. The old model of absolute confidentiality, where personal suffering was hidden as a matter of state policy, could no longer hold in a world that had witnessed Diana's powerful testimony. Her struggle and her subsequent openness created a before and after in the history of royal health crises, proving that sometimes the most subversive and transformative act a royal can perform is not to conceal their humanity, but to reveal it. Diana's unprecedented openness did not just create a media moment. It fundamentally rewrote the royal rulebook on health and vulnerability, leaving a legacy that the monarchy is still navigating today. Her willingness to speak with such raw honesty about bulimia and depression shattered the ancient taboo that required royals to present an image of seamless, invulnerable perfection. Before her, the official stance was one of absolute confidentiality, where any sign of physical or mental frailty was treated as a state secret, to be locked away behind palace gates. Diana's Panorama interview changed that calculus forever. By placing her own painful, private struggles at the center of a global conversation, she demonstrated a startling new truth: that public connection could be forged not through flawless strength, but through shared human fragility. This was a direct challenge to the very core of the Windsor Doctrine, which held that mystique was maintained through distance and silence. She proved that authenticity could be a far more powerful tool for building public support, creating a bond of empathy with millions who saw their own struggles reflected in her. In the years following her death, this seismic shift created a new and difficult tension for the royal family. The old guard, steeped in tradition, clung to the belief that discretion was the better part of valor. Yet a new generation of royals, who came of age in a world shaped by Diana's candor, began to cautiously test the waters of a more transparent approach. They understood that in a 24/7 media landscape, the old strategy of blanket denial was no longer tenable. The public, having been given a glimpse of the real people behind the crowns, now expected a degree of openness that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. The institution was forced to adapt, moving slowly and often reluctantly from a policy of strict confidentiality to one of carefully managed, cautious transparency. This new approach is not about full disclosure, but about controlled acknowledgement, a way to satisfy public curiosity and demonstrate humanity without sacrificing the dignity and mystique that are essential to the monarchy's survival. We see this delicate balancing act most clearly in the way modern royals like Prince William, Prince Harry, and Catherine, the Princess of Wales, have begun to discuss mental wellness. They don't share the harrowing, intimate details that Diana did, but they have normalized the conversation in a way that was previously impossible. Prince William and Prince Harry's public advocacy for mental health charities and their own admissions of struggling with grief and the pressure of their roles would have been inconceivable without the path their mother blazed. They speak of the importance of "it's okay to not be okay," a simple yet revolutionary statement for the House of Windsor. This represents a monumental cultural shift within the institution. It's a recognition that in the modern world, a royal's value is not solely in their symbolic perfection, but also in their relatable humanity. The monarchy has learned, largely because of Diana, that acknowledging common struggles like anxiety or postnatal depression does not diminish their stature. It can actually strengthen their connection to the people they serve, making the institution feel more relevant and resilient. This is the core of Diana's legacy. She redefined royal strength from an impenetrable fortress to a resilient human heart, proving that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in hiding your wounds, but in showing them, and in doing so, giving others the permission to heal. Long before the world saw him as the future king, a young Prince William was at the center of a medical emergency, so serious it could have defined his public image before he was old enough to understand its weight. While the public memory is filled with images of a happy, robust schoolboy, a carefully guarded incident from his adolescence reveals the immense lengths the palace would go to protect his chance at a normal life. The story begins in the summer of 1991, when William was just 9 years old and a pupil at Ludgrove School in Berkshire. During a friendly game of golf with a friend, he was accidentally struck in the side of the head with a golf club. The initial impact seemed bad, but not catastrophic. He was checked by the school matron, and after a brief observation, seemed to recover. It was only days later, after he had returned to his parents at Balmoral for the summer holidays, that the true danger revealed itself. He began to complain of persistent and worsening abdominal pain. Alarmed, his parents had him immediately examined, and the diagnosis was swift and frightening. The blow to his head had been a red herring. The real injury was internal. The force of the impact had caused a significant rupture in his spleen, an organ vital for filtering blood and fighting infection. A ruptured spleen is a life-threatening medical emergency. It can lead to catastrophic internal bleeding, shock, and if not treated swiftly and correctly, death. For a child, the situation is even more perilous. Prince Charles and Princess Diana were faced with every parent's worst nightmare, but their reaction had to be measured against the blinding glare of the global media spotlight that perpetually followed their family. The decision was made with lightning speed and absolute secrecy. The young prince was rushed not to a public hospital, where the news would leak in minutes, but to the exclusive Great Ormond Street Hospital for Children in London, one of the world's leading pediatric institutions. There, he was placed under the care of a top surgical team who understood that their young patient was also a matter of national security. The palace machinery, honed by decades of managing crises, swung into its most covert mode. A strict and total media blackout was imposed. No press releases were issued. No bulletins were given. To the outside world, it was as if nothing had happened. The royal correspondents for major newspapers, who had intricate networks of sources within the palace walls, were approached by senior courtiers and given a stark, off-the-record briefing. They were told in no uncertain terms that the prince's life had been in danger, that his recovery was the only priority, and that any reporting on the incident would be seen as a profound and unforgivable breach of trust, with consequences for their future access. This was not a request. It was a directive backed by the full authority of the monarchy. Incredibly, in an era already hungry for celebrity news, the press complied. The code of silence held. The palace's strategy was rooted in a hard-learned lesson from the past. They had seen how the relentless scrutiny had damaged Princess Margaret and fueled Diana's own struggles. For William, the goal was different. This was not about hiding a scandal or a hereditary flaw. It was about fiercely guarding a child's right to privacy and a semblance of a normal childhood. The incident was a perfect storm of everything they feared: a sudden, violent accident, a life-threatening diagnosis, and a prolonged recovery that would have been sensationalized in the press. Headlines about a fighting for his life heir would have permanently painted him as fragile in the public imagination, overshadowing his school achievements and personal development with a narrative of victimhood. His treatment at Great Ormond Street was intense and required a significant period of convalescence. He could not engage in sports or any strenuous activity for months, as a jolt or fall could have re-triggered the internal bleeding. Managing this at his boarding school, surrounded by other active young boys, required a discreet and carefully orchestrated plan. The school staff were brought into the circle of confidence, and a quiet protocol was established to ensure his safety without singling him out or making him the subject of gossip. This behind-the-scenes effort was a testament to the shared understanding that William's well-being as a person was paramount. The success of this cover-up is almost unparalleled in modern royal history. The story did not break until years later, long after William had fully recovered and was well on his way to becoming the confident young man the world would later see at Eton College and University. When it finally emerged, it was presented as a historical footnote, a past crisis cleanly resolved, with no lingering aura of fragility attached to him. This event stands in stark contrast to the health crises of previous generations. It was not a constitutional threat like King George III's Porphyria, nor a dynastic disaster like the hemophilia of the Romanovs. It was a private, accidental injury to a child who also happened to be second in line to the throne. The palace's handling of it signals a crucial evolution in royal crisis management, a recognition that in the modern age, protecting the human being inside the royal title is sometimes the most important duty of all. It was a quiet, determined victory for normality, ensuring that Prince William's childhood could be defined by his own character and experiences, not by a single, terrifying headline. The protocols surrounding the health of a direct heir to the throne, such as Prince William, represent a sophisticated evolution of royal crisis management, a system that prioritizes the preservation of public confidence above all else. This is not the panicked secrecy of the Romanovs or the brutal cover-ups of the Georgian era. It is a calm, meticulously planned, and highly professional operation designed to control the narrative from the very first moment a medical issue arises. The entire strategy hinges on a single, unwavering principle. The heir must be perceived as a figure of unwavering stability and robust health, a living embodiment of the nation's future. To achieve this, a multi-layered protocol is activated, beginning with the deliberate choice of medical care. Unlike a regular citizen, an heir will almost never be treated in a standard National Health Service hospital's public wing. The destination is invariably a prestigious private clinic, like the London Clinic or King Edward VII's Hospital, institutions renowned for their discretion as much as their medical excellence. These facilities are fortresses of privacy, with secure entrances, private suites, and staff who have signed stringent non-disclosure agreements. This environment allows for a complete informational lockdown, creating a sterile bubble where the heir can receive treatment far from the prying lenses of the media and the anxiety of the public. It transforms a medical event from a public spectacle into a contained, private affair, giving the palace the precious commodity of time to assess the situation, formulate a message, and release information only when they are ready. Once inside this secure medical environment, the next phase of the protocol begins, the crafting of the official bulletin. These are not simple medical statements. They are masterclasses in strategic communication, carefully worded documents where every term is chosen for its specific connotation and its potential impact on public perception. The language is deliberately calm, reassuring, and often deliberately vague. You will almost never see alarming terms like cancer, emergency surgery, or life-threatening. Instead, the palace press office employs a lexicon of euphemisms designed to minimize alarm. A procedure becomes corrective surgery. A serious infection is a bout of peritonitis requiring hospitalization, and a complex diagnostic process is framed as a series of tests. This is not about lying, but about framing. The goal is to present any health issue as a temporary, manageable inconvenience, a minor interruption in the heir's steady service, rather than a fundamental threat to his well-being. The bulletins are also notably sparse on specific clinical details. They will confirm the nature of the condition in broad strokes and the planned treatment, but they omit the granular, often worrying specifics that could fuel speculation and fear. This controlled release of information serves to starve the rumor mill, ensuring that the palace's version of events is the only one in circulation. The authority of the source, the official royal communication, combined with the reassuring tone, works to pacify public concern before it can even properly form. Perhaps the most crucial element of this modern protocol is the strategic timing of announcements. The palace has learned from past debacles that a reactive approach to issuing statements as a crisis unfolds leads to a loss of narrative control. Instead, they have perfected the art of the preemptive, post-facto announcement. In an ideal scenario, the public will learn of a health issue only after it has been successfully resolved. Imagine a scenario where the heir undergoes a scheduled surgical procedure on a Monday. The palace would release no information on Sunday, nothing on Monday morning. The first the world hears of it is on Tuesday afternoon, with a bulletin stating that the procedure was completed the day before, was entirely successful, and that the heir is now resting comfortably and is expected to make a full recovery. This approach effectively eliminates the crisis period from the public timeline. There is no anxious vigil, no hourly updates, no speculation about the outcome. The story is presented as a closed loop, a problem identified, a solution implemented, a recovery underway. This method protects the heir from being photographed looking pale and vulnerable upon entering or leaving the hospital, and it prevents the media from camping outside for days. The first images the public sees are often carefully managed shots released by the palace days or weeks later, showing the heir looking healthy and active, thereby visually reinforcing the narrative of a swift and complete return to form. This entire protocol, the private clinic, the coded bulletins, the strategic timing, is a testament to the monarchy's understanding of the modern media landscape. It is a system built not on denying reality, but on managing its perception with an almost surgical precision, ensuring that the figure who represents the future of the crown is always seen through a lens of strength and stability, no matter what private medical challenges they may be facing. While his brother's childhood injury was successfully shielded from public view, Prince Harry's own profound psychological wounds would eventually be laid bare in a manner that broke from royal tradition, revealing a confidential battle with trauma that began not in the palace, but on the battlefield. For a decade, the public image of Prince Harry was one of a cheerful, sometimes reckless, military officer, the fun-loving spare who seemed to embody a kind of untroubled bravado. He completed 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, first as a forward air controller and later as an Apache helicopter co-pilot and gunner. The official narrative presented by the monarchy and the Ministry of Defense was one of pride and professionalism, focusing on his service and his camaraderie with his unit. What was meticulously omitted from this public portrait was the deep and lasting psychological scar tissue that those combat experiences left behind. As an Apache gunner, his role was to provide aerial support for ground troops, a position that placed him in the devastating position of witnessing the brutal reality of war from the sky, a perspective that could be both detached and intensely intimate. He later revealed that he compartmentalized the trauma, locking it away upon his return to Britain, adhering to the military and cultural ethos of the stiff upper lip that he had been born into twice over. The death of his mother when he was just 12 years old had already created a foundation of unresolved grief, and the experiences in Afghanistan layered a new, more complex form of post-traumatic stress onto that old wound. The confident, smiling prince seen at public events was often a facade, behind which was a young man struggling with severe anxiety, panic attacks, and a simmering, directionless anger that he didn't fully understand. For years, he coped in ways that were both typical for a man of his age and station, and also deeply concerning, partying heavily, seeking adrenaline rushes, and avoiding any quiet moment where the memories might surface. This was his confidential crisis, a private war being waged in his mind, known only to his innermost circle and completely hidden from the world by the palace's overarching policy of presenting an image of royal stability and strength. The institution, so adept at managing physical ailments and genetic scandals, had no framework for addressing this kind of invisible injury, and so Harry's suffering continued, unacknowledged and untreated, for nearly a decade after he left the army. The turning point came not from a palace directive, but from a personal breaking point in the intervention of his older brother. After years of what he described as total chaos in his life, of feeling on the verge of punching someone and experiencing severe anxiety during public engagements, Prince William finally urged him to seek help. This was a monumental moment, challenging generations of ingrained behavior. For a royal, and particularly for a military veteran, admitting a need for psychological help was seen as a sign of weakness. Yet, in a quiet rebellion against this toxic tradition, Harry listened. He began seeing a therapist, a decision he kept intensely private for a long time. In these confidential sessions, he began the arduous work of unpacking a lifetime of suppressed emotion. He connected the dots between the trauma of losing his mother so publicly and the trauma he experienced in combat. He learned that his anger and anxiety were not character flaws, but symptoms of post-traumatic stress, a normal reaction to profoundly abnormal circumstances. This therapeutic journey was his true confidential health battle, fought not in a hospital ward, but in a therapist's office, a battle to reclaim his own mind from the ghosts of his past. It was during this period of intense self-reckoning that the idea for the Invictus Games was born. The project was, on its surface, an international sporting event for wounded, injured, and sick servicemen and women. But for Harry, it was something far more personal. It was his own therapy, externalized and transformed into a global force for healing. He had witnessed firsthand the power of sport and camaraderie in the recovery of American veterans during the Warrior Games in the United States, and he realized that the same model could provide a lifeline for countless others, and in the process, perhaps, for himself. The Invictus Games became his mission, a constructive channel for all the pain, frustration, and loyalty he felt toward his fellow soldiers. It was a way to create meaning from his own suffering, to build a platform where the very vulnerabilities he had been taught to hide could be celebrated as symbols of strength and resilience. The genius of the Invictus Games as a confidential healing mechanism was its ability to address trauma without ever forcing anyone to speak of it directly. Harry understood that for many veterans, talking about their psychological wounds was the hardest battle of all. The games offered a different path. Through the intense physical challenge of competition, whether in wheelchair, basketball, indoor rowing, or powerlifting, participants could rebuild their shattered sense of identity and purpose. The focus was on what they could still do, not what they had lost. The shared experience of training and competing created a powerful, unspoken bond among the athletes, a community of understanding where the need for words about pain and trauma often evaporated. They could see their own struggles reflected in the eyes of their teammates, and in that recognition, they found a profound sense of belonging that isolation had stolen from them. Harry, by founding and championing the games, was creating the very support system he himself had lacked for so long. In becoming a vocal advocate for these veterans, he was indirectly advocating for his own unhealed parts. Every speech he gave about the importance of mental resilience, every moment he spent with an athlete, listening to their story, was a step in his own ongoing recovery. He was normalizing the conversation around invisible injuries, not through clinical language, but through the visceral, inspiring spectacle of human triumph over adversity. The games provided him with a socially acceptable, even laudable, reason to publicly engage with the topics of trauma and recovery, allowing him to cautiously bring his own confidential struggles into the light without having to center himself in the narrative. He could say, "Look at these incredible people and what they have overcome." And in doing so, he was also quietly telling his own story. This careful, project-based approach to disclosure allowed Prince Harry to fundamentally redefine the public's understanding of royal strength. For centuries, the monarchy's power had been projected through symbols of invulnerability: the crown, the scepter, the unwavering composure. Harry introduced a new symbol, the scar, both physical and psychological, not as a mark of shame, but as a badge of honor. By creating the Invictus Games, he engineered a platform that made it safe for him, and by extension for others, to be vulnerable. He began to cautiously integrate his own truth into his public persona. In interviews surrounding the games, he started to speak more openly about his own mental health, about the need to process grief, and about the destructive impact of suppressing emotion. He was not giving a clinical diagnosis of his own PTSD in a palace bulletin. He was weaving his experience into a larger, more relatable human story of struggle and resilience. This was a revolutionary departure from the handling of every previous royal health crisis. King George III's Porphyria was hidden behind euphemisms about bile. The Romanovs concealed Alexei's hemophilia at all costs. Even Princess Diana's bulimia was a secret she fought to manage alone before her explosive interview. Harry's approach was different. He used a positive, collective endeavor as a Trojan horse to normalize his own confidential struggles. The Invictus Games became his truth, told not in a confession, but in action. The event itself was his statement, a living, breathing testament to the idea that true strength lies not in hiding your wounds, but in using them to help others heal. In doing so, he not only found a path through his own trauma, but also compelled the ancient institution of the monarchy, however reluctantly, to make space for a new, more authentic, and profoundly human kind of courage. This gradual shift from silence to advocacy represents one of the most profound transformations in modern royal history. A slow and often reluctant acknowledgement that the ancient institution's survival in the 21st century depends on its ability to embrace a more authentic human connection with the public it serves. For generations, the monarchy's approach to mental health was defined by a single, unyielding principle: the stiff upper lip. This was not merely a cultural preference, it was a strategic doctrine. The crown's authority was believed to be rooted in an image of unwavering stability and divine right invincibility. To admit to vulnerabilities of the mind was seen as far more dangerous than acknowledging a physical ailment. A broken leg could heal, but a troubled mind suggested a fundamental weakness at the very core of the institution, a crack in the foundation that could call the entire structure into question. This philosophy meant that the psychological struggles of figures like Princess Margaret were systematically ignored, medicated into silence, or dismissed as personal failings, their pain hidden behind a veil of palace euphemisms and enforced solitude. The system simply had no vocabulary for mental health, treating it not as a medical issue, but as a character flaw or a public relations liability to be contained at all costs. The human toll of this policy was immense, creating a legacy of private suffering where individuals were forced to sublimate their pain for the perceived greater good of the monarchy, their inner realities completely divorced from their public personas. The watershed moment that shattered this centuries-old wall of silence was, of course, Diana's unprecedented candor. Her public discussion of bulimia and depression in the 1995 Panorama interview was a direct challenge to the established order, an act that palace traditionalists viewed not as bravery, but as a profound betrayal. She took a confidential crisis and placed it squarely in the public domain, forcing a global conversation and creating a new, uncomfortable expectation of transparency. In the immediate aftermath, the institution recoiled. The official response was a doubling down on discretion, a reassertion of the old ways in an attempt to restore the mystique Diana had so effectively punctured. For years, it seemed as if the palace had successfully walled itself off from this new reality, maintaining a stoic facade while the public's understanding of mental health evolved rapidly outside the palace gates. The real, lasting change would not come from the top down, but from a new generation who had lived in the shadow of their mother's honesty and their own private grief. Princes William and Harry grew up in a world where the taboo their mother broke was slowly becoming a mainstream conversation. Their own traumatic loss, experienced so publicly, gave them a personal, unshakable foundation for understanding the importance of psychological well-being. They represented a new kind of royal, one who could bridge the gap between the ancient demands of their role and the modern understanding of human vulnerability. The emergence of William and Harry as mental health advocates was therefore a quiet revolution, carefully calibrated to be palatable to the institution while still pushing its boundaries. They did not begin with shocking personal revelations, but with a strategic, project-based approach. Their founding of the Heads Together campaign in 2016 was a masterstroke. By uniting several mental health charities under the banner of a single, high-profile initiative, they created a platform that allowed them to advocate for the cause without initially centering their own experiences. This was advocacy in the royal tradition, philanthropic, dignified, and focused on the work of established organizations. It provided a safe, structured way to bring the conversation about mental wellness into the royal portfolio, lending the immense credibility of the crown to a topic that had once been deemed too sensitive for its association. The genius of Heads Together was its framing. It wasn't about mental illness in a clinical, scary sense, but about mental fitness, a proactive and positive concept that anyone could relate to. They appeared in videos and at events talking about the importance of conversation with the same ease and commitment they might discuss wildlife conservation or youth sports, effectively normalizing the topic and draining it of the stigma that had plagued previous generations. This carefully managed advocacy, however, soon demanded a deeper level of personal testimony to maintain its credibility, leading to a new phase of cautious disclosure. Prince William began speaking about the emotional toll of his work as an air ambulance pilot, alluding to the trauma of attending to critical incidents and the importance of decompressing with his team. This was a significant step, connecting his royal duty to a recognizably human emotional response. But it was his brother, Harry, who truly crossed the Rubicon, first in an interview with the Daily Telegraph in 2017, where he acknowledged that he had spent nearly 20 years not thinking about his mother's death and had only recently sought counseling to deal with the grief that was causing him chaos and anxiety. This was a bombshell, delivered not in a sensationalist tell-all, but in the context of his advocacy work. He was leveraging his platform not just to raise awareness, but to model the very behavior he was promoting. His subsequent, even more detailed revelations about using therapy to process his trauma and his struggles with acute anxiety marked the definitive end of the old model of royal confidentiality regarding mental health. He demonstrated that a prince, a soldier, and a man could be strong enough to admit he needed help, redefining royal strength not as stoic silence, but as the courage to be vulnerable and the resilience to seek healing. This new era of openness, however, exists in a state of perpetual and delicate tension with the monarchy's enduring need for privacy and mystique. The institution, under the leadership of the late Queen and now King Charles III, has embraced the language of mental health awareness, but its actions remain constrained by a deep-seated institutional caution. The goal is a controlled, beneficial transparency, not full disclosure. There is a clear line that even the most modern royals are not expected to cross. The public is not entitled to know about a royal's specific diagnosis, their therapeutic journey, or the intimate details of their emotional struggles. This creates a complex balancing act. William and Harry's advocacy was celebrated, but when Harry and Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex, later discussed their mental health struggles with even greater candor, including revelations of suicidal ideation, it was met with a palpable institutional unease, highlighting the limits of the palace's comfort with this new transparency. The modern monarchy is therefore navigating an uncharted path, trying to project relatable humanity without sacrificing the dignified distance that is part of its power. It is an ongoing negotiation between the personal right to privacy and the public's growing expectation of authenticity, a struggle to integrate a modern understanding of psychological well-being into a centuries-old institution whose very foundation was built on the projection of flawless, unwavering strength. Even for a monarch whose reign had been defined by an almost supernatural consistency, the global pandemic presented a unique challenge, forcing the palace to navigate a health crisis that was both intensely public and deeply confidential. When the announcement finally came in February 2022 that Queen Elizabeth II had tested positive for COVID-19, the official statement was a masterclass in the well-honed art of reassurance. The world was told she was experiencing mild, cold-like symptoms and would continue with light duties at Windsor Castle. This phrasing was deliberately chosen to project an image of business as usual, of a monarch so steadfast that even a virus that had felled millions was little more than a minor inconvenience. The carefully curated photos released around this time showed her conducting a virtual audience, smiling from behind a desk. The only sign of her condition, a slight hoarseness in her voice that was noted by those who listened closely. This was the public narrative. A resilient 95-year-old sovereign brushing off an illness with characteristic grit. But behind the castle walls, the reality was almost certainly far more serious and meticulously concealed. For a woman of her advanced age, COVID-19 is never a trivial matter. It carries a dramatically heightened risk of hospitalization, severe complications, and death. The palace's decision to downplay the severity was not a deception in the malevolent sense, but a calculated act of statecraft. The Queen's physical person was, in a very real way, a symbol of the nation's continuity and stability. To have the public witness a steep and visible decline in her health would have been a profound psychological blow to a country already weary from lockdowns and loss. Every cough, every day of fever, every moment of the profound exhaustion that defines this virus was treated with the same level of confidentiality as a matters of national security, hidden from view to preserve the vital illusion of unwavering strength. The most telling clue to the true nature of her struggle emerged not from a bulletin, but from her own forced and highly unusual cancellations. Shortly after her diagnosis, she reluctantly pulled out of several key virtual engagements, a move that those inside the royal circle recognized as highly significant. For Queen Elizabeth II, duty was the absolute core of her being. She had never missed a Remembrance Sunday service until the year before, and even then, it was due to a sprained back, not a fleeting illness. To cancel even remote online duties signaled that she was facing something far more debilitating than a common cold. Privately, it was later revealed by those with knowledge of the situation that she was experiencing what she herself described as exhausting fatigue. This was not mere tiredness. It was the kind of bone-deep, overwhelming weariness that is a hallmark of a significant COVID-19 infection, especially in older adults. She reportedly lost her sense of taste and smell, adding to the misery, and spent days resting in her private apartments, isolated from all but her most essential staff and medical team. The medical protocols enacted would have been rigorous and discreet. Her physicians likely monitored her oxygen saturation levels constantly, watching for any sign of the silent hypoxia that can turn a mild case into a medical emergency within hours. The availability of antiviral treatments would have been on immediate standby, their administration a closely guarded secret. The entire household operated under a veil of silence, understanding that a single leak about the Queen struggling for breath or needing supplemental oxygen would trigger a media firestorm and public alarm on a global scale. This confidential battle was made all the more sensitive by the Queen's age. At 95, she was the oldest monarch in British history, and every minor health issue was inevitably viewed through the lens of her mortality. The palace had spent decades expertly managing the narrative of her health, from her hip replacement surgery to more recent episodes that required overnight hospital stays, always framing them as minor, planned procedures. But COVID-19 was different. It was an unpredictable external threat that respected no protocol and obeyed no palace schedule. The virus's capricious nature meant that her medical team could not offer the usual assurances of a straightforward recovery. There would have been anxious days and nights at Windsor, with her doctors weighing the risks of every potential complication, from pneumonia to cardiovascular stress, all while the public was being told she was in good spirits and looking forward to returning to work. The strategy was a high-stakes gamble, betting on her legendary constitution to pull her through while the machinery of the monarchy worked overtime to ensure that the outside world saw only calm and continuity. Her eventual recovery was, like the illness itself, presented as a foregone conclusion. When she reappeared for public duties, she did so gradually, her engagements carefully selected to show her at her best. The message was clear. The institution had weathered the storm. Yet, for those watching closely, the woman who emerged from her bout with COVID-19 seemed subtly changed. She began using a walking stick more consistently, and her energy levels appeared to have been permanently recalibrated. The confidential toll of the virus had been high, a private ordeal that perhaps accelerated the natural processes of aging, a hidden cost of a life lived in the unrelenting service of the crown. The protocols for a monarch's contagious illness form a secret playbook of statecraft, a set of procedures designed to manage a biological threat as if it were a national security breach. When a virus infiltrates the royal household, the response is immediate and multifaceted, operating on the principle that the sovereign's body is a vessel of state stability, and its compromise cannot be allowed to trigger public alarm or political uncertainty. The moment a diagnosis like COVID-19 is confirmed, the monarch enters a state of medically mandated isolation that is far more complex than simply staying in their rooms. For the late Queen, this meant the entire HMS bubble. The strict household system established at Windsor Castle during the pandemic would be reinforced. Access would be reduced to a single, dedicated team of staff and medical professionals, all living on site and operating in a closed circuit to prevent any external transmission. This bubble within a bubble was designed not just to protect the Queen from others, but to protect the institution from the consequences of a wider outbreak within the royal household that could incapacitate the entire line of succession. Every meal, every piece of correspondence, every interaction is stripped down to the bare essentials, conducted with surgical levels of precaution. The royal physicians, sworn to a confidentiality that transcends standard patient-doctor privilege, become the commanders of this isolation zone, constantly monitoring vital signs and ready to escalate care within the palace's own medical facilities before the outside world ever knows the situation has worsened. This isolation is as much about perception as it is about medicine. By physically removing the monarch from public view, the palace gains the precious commodity of time and control, allowing them to manage the narrative without the complicating factor of daily photographs or sightings that would inevitably spark speculation and fear. Simultaneously, and with the utmost discretion, the gears of constitutional continuity begin to turn. A contagious illness in the sovereign automatically triggers a quiet, behind-the-scenes review of the Regency Acts, while a full regency, transferring the monarch's powers to the heir, is a last resort reserved for complete incapacity. A contagious disease prompts a more nuanced activation of what officials term functional delegation. The monarch's daily boxes of state papers, a tangible symbol of power containing everything from cabinet minutes to intelligence briefings, do not simply stop arriving. Instead, a secure, digital or physically sanitized chain of custody is established to allow the sovereign to continue working in isolation if they are able. However, contingency plans are immediately readied. The Privy Council office and the monarch's private secretary engage in confidential discussions with the heir to the throne, ensuring they are briefed and prepared to assume certain symbolic duties at a moment's notice. The focus is on a seamless transition of public-facing functions. Virtual engagements might be pre-recorded or handed off to other senior royals to maintain the illusion of an uninterrupted, active monarchy. The entire operation is designed to be invisible, a silent shifting of weight within the institution to ensure it remains upright and stable, even if its central pillar is temporarily weakened. There is no grand announcement, no official declaration that powers are being delegated. The public might notice that the Prince of Wales is suddenly undertaking more solo video calls, or that the monarch's weekly audience with the Prime Minister is conducted with the heir present, but they would be unaware that these are carefully choreographed elements of a constitutional safety protocol, activated to prevent any vacuum of authority while preserving the dignified mystery. Crown, the most critical and delicate aspect of this entire process, however, is the absolute control of information. The palace press office transforms into a strategic command center, operating on a doctrine of minimal, reassuring, and deliberately vague disclosure. The infamous royal bulletins are crafted not to inform in detail, but to pacify and manage public sentiment. The language is a study in purposeful understatement. A potentially severe bout of COVID-19 becomes mild, cold-like symptoms. The exhausting, debilitating fatigue that often accompanies the virus is reframed as the Queen being in good spirits and undertaking light duties. This is not outright deception, but a form of benevolent misdirection, a strategy rooted in the historical understanding that panic is a contagion far more dangerous than any virus. The press, particularly the accredited royal correspondents, are handled with a mixture of firmness and privileged access. Senior editors and correspondents receive confidential, off-the-record briefings where the gravity of the situation may be hinted at more frankly, coupled with a stern reminder of their responsibility to avoid sensationalism. This creates a complicit relationship where the media, in possession of the sobering truth, often agrees to parrot the palace's calming public line, understanding that a national panic serves no one's interest. The goal is to starve the rumor mill of oxygen, to present a unified front of calm competence. There are no daily health updates, no speculative charts on the monarch's temperature or oxygen levels. Information is released only when it reinforces the desired narrative of steady recovery. A photo may be released days into the illness, carefully staged to show the monarch looking composed and busy, precisely to quell any building concern. This masterful control of the story is the modern equivalent of the royal physicians issuing bulletins about King George III's bilious fever. It uses medical-sounding language to convey reassurance, while deliberately obscuring the more frightening and politically destabilizing reality. In the end, the protocol for a monarch's contagious illness is the ultimate test of the monarchy's resilience, proving that its strength lies not just in the health of its individual members, but in the robust, unflappable system that exists to protect the institution from the all-too-human vulnerabilities of the person who wears the crown. And so, through these hidden histories of porphyria and hemophilia, of lung cancer and bulimia, of battlefield trauma and a global pandemic, a profound and enduring truth comes sharply into focus. The story of confidential royal health crises is not merely a collection of medical mysteries or political scandals. It is the story of the immense and often unbearable tension between the public institution of the monarchy and the private individual who must wear its crown. For centuries, the strategy was absolute secrecy. The body of the monarch was treated not as a fallible human vessel, but as a symbol of divine right and national stability, a pillar that could never be seen to crack. This institutional imperative forced kings, queens, and princes to endure their most painful and terrifying moments in isolated silence, their personal agony subsumed by the overwhelming need to project an image of invulnerability. From King George III, strapped to a chair and bled by physicians while the state called his torment a bilious fever, to the Romanovs hiding their son's hemophilia until the secret festered into a revolution, we see the catastrophic cost of this philosophy. The human being was sacrificed for the sake of the symbol, their pain locked away in palace sick rooms, a state secret more closely guarded than any treaty or treasury. This was a world where a cough could spark a constitutional crisis, and a genetic flaw could topple a 300-year-old dynasty. A world where the most powerful people on earth were often the most powerless when it came to their own health and how it was portrayed. Yet the trajectory of these stories also charts a slow, hesitant, but undeniable evolution toward a new kind of royal transparency. The old model of the stiff upper lip, that wartime ethos of emotional suppression that left Princess Margaret to medicate her despair in lonely silence, has been gradually, and sometimes painfully, challenged. The pivotal turning point was, without question, Diana, Princess of Wales. Her courageous decision to speak openly about her bulimia and depression was a revolutionary act that shattered the ancient dam of secrecy. She refused to let her suffering be a confidential footnote in a palace ledger. Instead, she placed it at the center of a global conversation, using her own vulnerability to forge a powerful, empathetic connection with millions. She demonstrated that strength could be redefined not as stoic silence, but as the resilience to seek help and the courage to be honest. This legacy, carried forward by her sons, has compelled the monarchy to inch toward a more modern understanding of its role in a therapeutic age. We see it in Prince William and Prince Harry's advocacy for mental health through the Heads Together campaign, and most powerfully in Harry's use of the Invictus Games as a vehicle to normalize the conversation around trauma without having to center his own story directly. The institution is learning, however reluctantly, that in the 21st century, public trust is built not on flawless perfection, but on relatable humanity. The carefully worded bulletins about Queen Elizabeth's COVID-19 diagnosis, while still masterclasses in reassurance, existed in a world that now expects at least a glimpse behind the curtain, a world that Diana made possible. This entire journey, from the locked wards of King George's palaces to the therapy sessions of a modern prince, invites us to perform a fundamental shift in our own perspective. It asks us to look past the glittering crowns, the majestic carriages, and the flawless official portraits, and to see the fragile human beings underneath. Every monarch who ever grappled with a hidden illness, every heir who lived in fear of a stumble, every princess who smiled for the cameras while her spirit was breaking, was a person first and a symbol second. They experienced the same primal fears, the same physical pain, and the same longing for understanding that defined the universal human condition. The immense privilege and power of their position came with an equally immense price: the surrender of their personal narrative, the loss of control over the most intimate truths of their own bodies and minds. The next time you see a royal figure fulfilling their public duties, consider the invisible weight they might be carrying. Consider the private battles they may be fighting, the confidential diagnoses they may be managing, and the centuries of pressure to appear perfectly strong at all times. The history of these health crises is a powerful reminder that behind the grandeur of any institution, there are always individuals, and that the cost of upholding a symbol can sometimes be paid in the quiet currency of human suffering. We would love to hear your thoughts on this delicate balance. In the comments below, tell us which of these stories resonated most deeply with you and why. Do you believe the monarchy's move toward greater transparency is a necessary evolution? Or does it risk undermining the mystique that has been its foundation for so long? How do we, as the public, balance our fascination with royalty with a respectful acknowledgement of their fundamental humanity? The conversation continues with you.